There's so much scientific evidence against evolution. So, how does this theory stay afloat? Does evolution really rely on religious arguments for its support? That is the claim that I'm making tonight. And if you disagree with me, I'll let you join a little bit later and share your reasons for your disagreement. But what I want to show you is that you will find religious arguments in popular books about evolution. You'll find them in textbooks about evolution. You'll find them in the original, The Origin of Species. And, and you'll even find religions made in scientific. So the religious arguments for evolution are used often. People are sometimes oblivious to it. Now, I want to give you a little bit of background of how I came to understand this, because when I first heard this argument, it completely went over my head. I didn't understand it at all. I didn't believe it. Okay. In my mind, okay, evolution was a scientific theory. And okay, it's maybe got some metaphysics involved, materialism, atheism, that kind of stuff. But, at its heart, the evidence is scientific. And I did not understand how deep the theological arguments for evolution are, and how they're very subtle, so it's easy to miss. But my first clue about it was that, I'd read all these books about evolution, like, I showed you Why Evolution is True and other popular books about evolution, and they were always bringing God into it. And I was like, wow, this is really weird. Why are they always bringing God? Why are they mentioning the creator? What's up with this? Like, and even evolutionists that I would talk to would often, like, if I'm asking for evidence, turn it around and say, why would God do this? And I always think it was strange. Okay. But I just kind of like, it just went over my head of like what was actually going on. Well, until I found a YouTube channel called Darwin's God. For those of you who know Dr. Cornelius Hunter, he's a biophysicist who's appeared on my channel a lot. And I found his channel, and at the end of his videos, he often says, religion drives science and it matters. And I just thought he meant like atheism or something like that. I didn't know what he meant. Okay. But then I invited him to come on my channel, and he told me, sure. And he said, what do you want to talk about? And I said, well, I'll leave that up to you. And he said, the most important thing to talk about is the religious nature of evolution. And so he wanted to do, is evolution inherently religious? He wanted to talk about the religious claims made by evolution. And I was like, well, that topic doesn't really float my boat, but okay, that's what he wants to do. So, okay, we'll do it. Well, in the meantime, I saw that he had books. So I read his first book, Science's Blind Spot, and I started to get what he was saying about the religious nature of evolution. Now, I read this, and then he came on my channel, and I was like, okay, I'm starting to see what he's talking about, but this is kind of a side issue. Like the religious stuff, it's kind of like a side thing. It's not the core. And he told me, look, if you don't understand this, you will never understand evolution. This is it. This is like what it is about. And so I just kept reading. I read his other book, Darwin's God. And then it all started to click for me. I started to notice that when people were talking to me about evolution, I started to realize that they were making religious arguments. And so this is all kind of like opened my eyes. And so I just want to share with you kind of what I've learned. And like I said, when I first heard this, I was like, what is it? This is kind of a side thing. This is not important. But now I see it is, because the main supporting evidence for evolution is religious. It's metaphysical. It is not scientific. And so if you get this, you'll understand a lot more about what's going on. Now, let me just start by giving you an example of this from this book, Why Evolution is True. And like I said, I noticed this when I was reading it. I was like, man, this guy talks about God a lot, for somebody who doesn't believe in God and believes in evolution. But I was like, okay, whatever. But, it didn't click that this was like key to his Why Evolution is True. This is the key. This is all throughout the book. And would an intelligent designer have created the small gap between the human ovary and fallopian tube so that an egg must cross this gap before it can travel through the tube and implant it in the uterus? Occasionally, a fertilized egg doesn't make the leap successfully and implants in the abdomen. This produces an abdominal pregnancy, and almost invariably fatal to the baby, and without surgery, the mother. The gap is a remnant of our fish and reptilian ancestors who shed eggs directly from the ovary to the outside of their bodies. The fallopian tube is an imperfect connection because it evolved later as an add-on in mammals. Now, so he's here using his argument of bad design. This is the designer wouldn't do it that way. This is an example. This had to evolve because a designer wouldn't do that way. And that's what helps bolster his argument for evolution. Now, that's just a popular book, but I can tell you that's not the only part of this book. This is littered throughout the book with arguments like that. But what about this? This is like more of like an evolution textbook, okay? And look what this author says. He says, closer study of many biological structures shows many design faults that a careful engineer would have avoided. In the vertebrate eye, for example, light must pass through a layer of nerve cells in order to reach the retina. A signal from the brain to the larynx needed to pass around the aorta in order to reach its target. Okay, so, a careful engineer would not have designed things this way. This is the argument used to bolster his argument for evolution. Now, the bad design argument is not the only religious argument that is made, but it's one that's often made. And I'm just going to take a quote from Origin of Species now. Darwin says, how inexplicable are the cases of serial homologies on the ordinary view of creation? Why should the brain be enclosed in a box composed of such numerous and such extraordinarily shaped pieces of bone, apparently representing vertebrae? As Owen has remarked, the benefit derived from the yielding of the separate pieces in an act of parturition by mammals will by no means explain the same construction of skulls of birds and reptiles. Why should similar bones have been created to form the wing and the leg of a bat, used as they are for such totally different purposes, namely flying and walking? Why should one crustacean, which has an extremely complex mouth formed of many parts, consequently always have fewer legs, or conversely, those with many legs have simpler mouths? So, and one final sentence, he says, why should the sepals, petals, stamens, pistils, and in each flower, though fitted for such distinct purposes, all be constructed on the same pattern? So another argument about God wouldn't do it this way. Why should all of these things be constructed from the same pattern? Why should things that have such different purposes be used, have the same type of structure? And he talks about this throughout his book. So and now one may think that these are side arguments, and I understand that, but you'll see the heart of it when I show you this paper, because this is a scientific paper that is completely based on a metaphysical assumption. Okay, so the entire paper, all that is done to test the common statistical evidence for common ancestry, it is all based on a metaphysical assumption. And so if you take away the metaphysical assumption, there's nothing to this at all. So all of the science involved, okay, it's good science, but it's used to support a conclusion where the conclusion is, it's completely based on a faulty assumption and a religious assumption. So let's just read the part of the abstract of this. So, since Darwin, biologists have come to recognize that the theory of descent from common ancestry is very well supported by diverse lines of evidence. However, while the qualitative evidence is overwhelming, we also need formal methods for quantifying the evidential support for common ancestry over the alternative hypothesis of separate ancestry. Okay, so this is what they're setting out to do, to test common ancestry versus separate ancestry. And what they found, this is their conclusion. We overwhelmingly rejected both species and family separate ancestry with infinitesimal p-values. We compare these results with those from 2 companion papers, which also found tremendously strong support for the common ancestry of all primates, and discuss future directions and general philosophical issues that pertain to the statistical testing of historical hypotheses such as common ancestry. Now, how do they go about testing common ancestry versus separate ancestry? So they have an idea that, hey, if there's common ancestry, then we're going to see a lot of the, we're going to see, we're going to be able to kind of trace a hierarchy of similarities, right? But what are they assuming about separate ancestry? How are they testing that? They can't. And that's where the metaphysical assumption comes in. They're assuming something about what separate ancestry would look like. Now, what Cornelius Hunter told me to do with this kind of thing is to always ask, how do you know? And what science experiment could you do to show that it is true? How do you know? So how do they know what separate ancestry looks like? They don't tell us. Okay, throughout the paper, they do not tell us how they know what they know about separate ancestry. And the key is there's no way to tap into that without making metaphysical assumptions. Okay, so how are they rejecting separate ancestry with infinitesimal p-values? It's by tapping into the theological or metaphysical assumptions, right? So now they say here, once we understand the patterns expected under common ancestry, we see the telltale signs all around us. As a result, ignoring criticisms motivated by non-scientific concerns, this is very ironic, the postulate of common ancestry is among the least controversial of scientific theories. However, many non-scientists and quite a few scientists accept common ancestry without really understanding the strength of the supporting evidence. Furthermore, some people, mainly but not entirely non-scientists, reject common ancestry under the impression that it lacks evidential support. The obvious antidote to such confusion would be to conduct statistical analysis to quantify the extent to which patterns in nature favor common ancestry over its alternative, separate ancestry. So this person is these authors are obviously setting out to show why the evidential support for common ancestry is so strong and it's so much against separate ancestry. But again, where are they getting their ideas about what separate ancestry looks like? They don't tell us, and there's no way to assess that scientifically. You have to tap into metaphysics in order to support your idea about what separate ancestry looks like. So now it's quite ironic that he's saying we're putting aside non-scientific concerns, but actually they're not putting aside non-scientific concerns. And this is a side note. This isn't really related to the religious thing, but I have to mention this because it's also really interesting that, when we're doing scientific experiments and things, like we're supposed to be able to have a null hypothesis, something that would falsify, something that would show that your idea is wrong, right? Like there should be, if you're saying that the evidence supports in one direction, then if it goes in the other direction, you should be able to say, well, then that's not support for common ancestry. But what's interesting that they acknowledge here is this is important because it leads us to an epistemological. Okay, wait. Let me go back a little bit. I didn't highlight this, but it's important to read. Sober and Steele acknowledged the merits of Penny et al., but made two important observations. First, they noted that the incongruent trees could even exist under common ancestry, especially in cases where the groups studied are very old, such that the phylogenetic signal has eroded. This is important because it leads to an epistemological asymmetry. High levels of congruence might be taken to reject separate ancestry in favor of common ancestry, whereas low levels of signal cannot be taken to refute common ancestry. We revisit this issue in the discussion. Second, they highlighted that under common ancestry, some congruence or apparent phylogenetic signal might be expressed if the subsets independently originated lineages, independently originated lineages have evolved under similar rules. Now, what's really interesting here is that they're basically saying whatever we find, it will support common ancestry, because they're saying, look, if we find that these trees don't show the hierarchy that we want, don't show the similarity and in the ways that we want, it could be because the signal got messed up, because it's just been too long, right? So it says, like, basically, if it doesn't show what we want, it can't refute common ancestry. Okay. But and basically they're saying if under there's some similarities that we find under separate ancestry that we're not expecting, then hey, that also doesn't, we also might expect that. So basically, whatever results they find, that's going to be support for common ancestry. So this is kind of a side note, because this isn't really about this part of it isn't really about the religious thing, but I just had to mention it because I find it interesting how flexible evolution is, where like anything like can be support for evolution. So it's very, very flexible. And there's never anything that is able to contradict it. Whenever there's a contradiction, a word is made up to explain why, we're seeing what we're seeing. Okay. But going on, back to the religious assumptions that they're making in order to conduct this experiment. A key feature of the species separate ancestry model is that for each character, the state drawn by each species is independent of that drawn by other species. As with species separate ancestry, we assume that each family ancestor, so they're doing two different tests of separate ancestry, one for species, one for family. And so it says with species separate ancestry, we assume that each family ancestor at its origin acquired character states at each character independently of all other family ancestors. Okay, why? Why is that the assumption they're making? Why are they assuming that that's what they would find under separate ancestry? In order to get an answer for why, why that's their idea, they have to go to the metaphysical. They either have to assume that naturalism is true, basically that, the only options are we evolved from a common ancestor by natural processes, or we evolved by separately by natural processes. Okay, so natural processes would be their metaphysical assumption, or they have to assume what a creator would have done. what a creator would have created with regard to similarities. So either way, they're making a metaphysical assumption about separate ancestry. There's nothing scientific about that. Absolutely nothing. So the entire experiment is based on their assumption. And so and here we see it clearly too. It says, separate ancestry predicts that the optimal trees for independent data sets should be no more similar to each other than trees selected at random from the set of possible trees. Wait, why is that what separate ancestry predicts? Why? Where did they get that information? How did they come by that? Is that a scientific observation, or is that a theological idea or a metaphysical idea that they have about reality? So they cannot say what separate ancestry predicts without that. So again, under separate ancestry, there is no true phylogenetic tree. What? How do they know? They never bother to tell us. They never bother to tell us why there is no phylogenetic tree under separate ancestry. Why? Because that is not scientific. They have no scientific way to tell us what is true of separate ancestry. And then it says, so any inference of character change along an optimal tree would have no reason to differentiate extant and extinct taxa. Okay. So, and this gets crazy. I mean, I don't know how much of this I should read, but I'll read this last one. I do have another one highlighted, but let me just read this last one because I think people are probably getting the point. Every test of species separate ancestry that we applied to the primates suggested that this model does a very poor job of explaining actual biological data as compared to common ancestry. Okay, and by the way, just for your information, they tested like a lot of different things. They tested genetics, they tested like testes of primates and a primate tooth. Okay, so they did some other, they did some little morphological and genetic tests to, compare common ancestry to separate ancestry. But anyway, many of these data sets reject species separate ancestry strongly. The probability of obtaining a test statistic more extreme than the one observed under the species separate ancestry model being incredibly small, often approaching or greatly exceeding the probability of picking the correct atom at random among the estimated 10 to the 80th atoms in the known universe. So basically he's saying, we know that common ancestry is true. We reject separate ancestry. There's no chance for that. It's like you would have to pick out an atom at random from the universe. That would be like how likely it would be for separate ancestry to be true. And all of this is non-scientific. Yes, they did a scientific experiment, but unfortunately, it was based on a metaphysical assumption. So it is totally worthless as a test of common ancestry versus separate ancestry. Okay, so this is showing you that these metaphysical ideas are so deeply embedded that a scientific paper can get published and nobody notices the religious assumptions involved. Peer reviewers looked at this, read this, and didn't see anything wrong with it. This is bizarre, right? Like this shows you how deep and how subtle these religious ideas are and how much they are used to bolster evolution. If we take out the metaphysical assumption, is there any evidence for evolution in this paper? Now, one could say, well, evolution predicts that we would have similarities. So there is some support for evolution. And okay, if evolution is really making that prediction, like, yes, we will see such and such similarity and we see it, then we can grant that as weak evidence for evolution. But it's not going to, the power in this is when it's contrasted with this strong claim of, oh, it's separate ancestry can't work. It's like picking an atom out of the universe. That's where the actual strong evidence is, right? And that's where the metaphysical claim is. So all that is useless. So could it still be sort of a weak evidence for evolution? Sure. But notice they even ruined their own evidence. They can't really use this as evidence either, because they invalidated it with their own like flexibility, meaning this can't be a test of evolution if no matter what we find, like we saw in this quote, basically if we find that there there isn't the phylogenetic signal that we want, then hey, maybe just it's been too long and things have evolved too much. So no matter what, they were going to accept the results as evidence for common ancestry. So anyway, so I still think this would be a very weak support, even if we could call it support for evolution. But the strength of it is in its metaphysical claim. And that is what I have noticed and what I've become aware of as people share their evidence for evolution with me. And just like Dr. Hunter said, the strong evidence is all religious. It is not in, the scientific evidence. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. And so I'm going to let people join the stream. And you may have to wait backstage if somebody's already joined. But I just also want to say someone recently told somebody that I respect recently told me that my channel is sort of like that I have the attitude of like, debate me, bro, like very adversarial. And I just want to say, if I have been adversarial, that's not the way that I want to be. And so really and truly, I want to have honest discussions about these things. And my intent is not at all to be adversarial with anyone. Now, if people come on here and start bullying me and trying to like get me to accept what they're saying and like won't accept what I'm saying, then I can get a bit adversarial, but I don't want to be that way. So I'm trying not to be that way. Okay. So please don't be scared to come on, because I do not want to beat anybody up. I just want to have discussion about this. And honestly, it's having discussions with people that keeps me going on this evolution channel. Like, it's really boring just to like make videos. And so it's really the dialogue with people that is like the heart of what keeps me going on this. All right. So, and I just want to, before I bring somebody on, I'm just going to say hi to a few people in the chat. And so Doc Savage said, did evolution become a religion since your last run through this topic? Do you consciously recycle these bits? I'm talking about this because I don't think it's been talked about enough. And I don't think it's been talked about to the degree that like where like people are really getting the full picture of what's going on. So same thing there. Okay. Hey, not evolution. Hey, Big Bad Mama. Hey, Sophia, Daisy May. Okay. Let's see. God ID says, of course, evolution theory is based on religion and theology. It's a synthesis of theological doctrines that seek validation through science, while at the same time denying other theologies right to do the same, labeling them as religion. Meanwhile, it conceals its own religion. Yes. Now, what's interesting is that some people will say it's concealing its religion of naturalism, materialism, like that's kind of like the religious thought. And Dr. Hunter has a different thought. He believes it's more about theism, more about protecting God, getting God away from the creation, getting God off the hook for the problem of evil, talking about what God would and wouldn't do. And so like getting God off the hook for bad design. And on Saturday, we're going to have a little discussion / debate between Dr. Hunter and someone who says like the core of evolution is atheism, and Dr. Hunter says no, it's theism. And so we're going to be talking about that on Saturday, so I'm looking forward to that. Hope you guys can join us. Hey Wesley, God bless you too, thank you so much. And so Vesuvian Doppelganger says, why couldn't animals have been created with similar genomes? Yes, exactly, thank you. There's no reason that it couldn't be that. And that's an assumption, right? The assumption about how God would make things. So Modal Surrealist says, if each independent kind were created with the exact pattern of correlations within unconstrained genetic material present today, we shouldn't find any correlation of the pattern in the pattern of signal decay. Okay, I'm not sure that I fully understand this comment, so I don't want to comment on it. But Modal Realist, you're always welcome to join. It's really hard to figure out what somebody's saying from chats. And hey, Junior, good to see you. Hey, Jamie, good to see you. And now I will invite Mike on. How you doing, Mike?
Good. You're putting me on first. How about that? Anyway, doing okay. Doing okay. I'm confused by your. Okay. So to you, what is religion? What does that mean? Is it metaphysics?
Yeah, it's ideas about reality, right? Like ideas about God, ideas about, intangible things.
The
So
core,
I'm not
or
saying that
basically.
this is a religious system like a church or something like that. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. Yeah, the closest I can come to thinking that my evolution as a religion is that I kind of worship complexity. I mean, my whole spiritual shtick is, on complexity and stuff like that. But anyway, so this idea that evolution is a religion. Okay, I was on with Sygart a couple days ago, and he's an old Earth evolutionist, basically. So he believes that we descended, all mammals descended from a common population. But he believes in God, and he believes in the resurrection and Jesus and all of that. So, but I believe the same thing as Sygart. So, and that's evolution, and so I study that. I study that common ancestry of all mammals, basically, and I study common ancestry of all primates, right? And we have vastly different metaphysics. So, how do you explain that? If evolution has to be a metaphysical religion that insists that God doesn't exist, then how do you explain Sygart?
Yeah, okay, so it's not the claim I'm making here is not that all evolutionists are following a religion or have the same
Right.
metaphysics or something like that. The claim that I'm making is that the strong support for evolution relies on religious, metaphysical assumptions. Okay, so
Okay, but
that's
no,
where it's
no.
deriving its support. Not that all evolutionists think the same. And, let me just clarify this, because when I've talked about this before, somebody wrote in the comments, I work in a lab as a scientist, and I can tell you God never gets brought up. And yes, of course,
Right.
we're not talking about God getting brought up. We're talking about what is underlying, what is actually supporting the evidence. And people may be completely unaware that it has anything to do with God or religious ideas, completely unaware. It's kind of like you're swimming in these waters, and it's like you're not aware of the waters that you're swimming in. Okay, so did you want to respond, Mike? Or
Yeah, that still doesn't explain Sygart, and it doesn't explain, like, okay, all of the evidence that I have that we have common ancestry with mice or with chimpanzees or other primates has nothing to do with any metaphysical assumption. And Sygart would agree completely with all the evidence that I would talk about. It has to do with looking at the genomes and the chromosomes and how they rearrange and restructure and they combine, they split apart. Mice have a different number of chromosomes than we do. Chimps have a different number of chromosomes than we do. And there's mechanism behind that, but all of that is evidence for evolution. And if we look at our common ancestry with mice, and then contrast that with our common ancestry with chimps, we'll find all these areas of the genome, like introns, the area in between the exons, the important part, they get clipped out and degraded. And we know that these things just get clipped out and they're degraded and they don't do anything. Those are just like random noise, right? And those things match very, very similar to chimps, almost nucleotide for nucleotide. But then if we go further back and we look at orangutans, they're a little bit more messed up. And the further we go back, the more messed up they are, the more different they are. And that tells us that we have a non-conserved part of DNA. And that's all evidence for evolution. And the other part, evidence for evolution would be embryology and all the biology of how animals develop based on the genome. All of that, Sygart would agree with me, and yet we have these vastly different worldviews. So how can you say that all of me and Cy's evidence is religious? I mean, because we're on different sides of the spectrum.
Yeah.
How is that?
Yeah. Okay. So can we just slow down about why it is evidence? So why when you compare mouse and human genomes, why is that evidence for evolution?
Okay, if the two ancestries were like separately created by some means, I would have to be really agnostic about what that is. Some random process or something created two separate lineages, so that mice and humans did not have a common ancestor. So that all mammals didn't have a common ancestor. Well, then in those non-conserved regions, I would see just noise. I'd see just randomness. I wouldn't see this phylogenetic signal, because the phylogenetic signal is really important when it comes to the non-conserved parts of the genome. And the other thing, let me see if I
Wait, can we stop there? We can come back
Yeah,
to your point, but I want to lock onto this because
Yeah.
this is actually the point I'm trying to make. So I want to ask you, how do you know that's what you would expect? Like, how do you know that that's not what you would expect if they had separate ancestry?
Yeah. So if it were if something created it as separate kinds, that whatever it was, there would be a causal connection with what we have today, with what we can see, the evidence we can see. There'd be a causal connection that would make it necessary for those two things to match a lot. Okay, they shouldn't match if there's no reason for them to match. Okay,
How do you
so what is the
know
reason?
what it would look like? This is exactly, Mike. I mean, and like, so you're illustrating the point exactly. Okay.
Okay,
You're making an assumption about what the creator would do.
what creator? I don't know what you're talking about,
You
because
said
I don't have.
if there was some sort of designer or, whatever word you used, you said, I wouldn't expect such and
Some
such.
process. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Some
Right.
process would have created it. Right.
So, and right there, it's showing that you have a theological idea about what a creator would do or
No,
not.
I don't have any idea what would have created it separately. I don't know.
Not what, but
No.
what that creator would do. Not what that being is,
What do you
but
mean
what
would
that
do?
creator would do.
What do you mean? What do you mean by
Okay.
would do? Are you
Yes.
saying that? Are you suggesting a particular kind of creator? Because
No,
if
not
you
right now.
are,
No.
then
I mean,
you're being religious and I'm not.
oh yeah, I
Because
mean,
I'm
I'm
being
definitely
agnostic
religious.
about it.
I'm definitely religious. Look,
Okay.
I
Okay.
believe a
So
story. I'm very religious. I believe God created. Okay. So my theology
is that
is
what you
out
want
there
to
on
talk
the
about?
table. But
Okay.
but now we got to see what your theology is, because you are expressing a theology here, because you're saying, I asked you,
Not
why
really.
is this evidence, why is this like evidence for evolution? Why is this what you would expect under common ancestry and not separate
Sorry.
ancestry? It's okay. And you said, because like if it was some sort of creator, designer, whatever, then I wouldn't expect there to be this noise, these introns that shared similarities with the introns, right?
Well,
So
it might be.
you're making an assumption. That's a theological assumption about what a creator would make.
When you see a pattern, there has to be a cause for the pattern, right? Like there has to be something causal that causes the pattern. And so when we see this phylogenetic signal, we're seeing a pattern. So there has to be something basically that caused it. And in evolution, the idea is that something is because we share a common ancestor, a common population ancestor with all mammals, right? So we have these patterns and we see that pattern. Now, if you're saying that pattern could have, like the papers and the books that you mentioned, are people that are basically kind of trying to disprove your position, not evolution. The evidence for evolution has nothing to do with your position. Okay. And as is obvious when you talk to Saigar, because he and I have very, very different metaphysical views, yet we rely on the same evidence to believe in a common ancestry of mammals. Now, there was something else that you came up with. Oh, okay, so we got these random areas. We see this pattern in this random, not necessary introns, and we see this pattern, and we see this pattern in viruses and how the viruses jump around and all that. And there has to be something that caused that pattern, right? So if you're saying, now, if you want to go over and talk about your God and how your God created it, well, then how did your God create those introns? I mean, those introns are just cut out and they're not needed for anything. Did your God write down those introns when he made a mouse? And then he took the same copy and just modified it a little bit when he made humans? What did your,
Well,
I
that's a
mean,
question I'm
you're
not going to
talking
be able
about,
to answer. Yeah,
you're the religious person, evolutionists are not. I mean, I could
okay.
be
Look, and
completely agnostic about this.
yeah, I admit that I'm a religious person, and I admit I can't answer questions about how and why God did certain things, okay? But there's a couple
Why?
assumptions that you're making. Well, anyway, we're trying to get to the I don't want to get distracted on that, because this is important, because you're actually hitting on one of the key supports for evolution that is completely theological and not at all scientific. Okay. You're
It's
calling it
totally
scientific
scientific. It's all
evidence.
causal.
Now, I know in your mind it's scientific. I realize that. But what I'm
Oh, but
trying to
I'm
do is
wrong, right? You're
get
saying I'm
you
wrong?
to see. Yes, I am saying
Okay.
that. Okay.
Okay.
So
Okay. Prove it.
because what you're doing is you're tapping into, why would a creator make the introns like
No,
this?
no.
And
I don't
and
care
you're
about a
saying like they're
creator.
useless. And by the way, introns have function, right? So they're not completely useless. Just because they get spliced out later doesn't mean they're not important for something. And if we don't know the function of something, right, we a lot of times in biology find out later that it has an important function that we were not aware of. So
We're not going to
we
find out
shouldn't
with
make these
introns.
assumptions about introns, but even so, we already know that introns do have function, right? Like
Some
they're
do.
part of getting the gene expressed, right?
Some, no, not very, very few of them
Okay.
are. Very small percentage.
But
Introns
so
mostly, introns grow kind of naturally. Like you probably have some introns that are different than the introns that I have, that are bigger. A virus jumped in, or there was a duplication or a copy problem or something. And so between you and I, we probably have uh, thousands of introns that are different. And those things get clipped out. We know they get clipped out. If they didn't all get clipped out and degraded, the cell could never function. There'd be too many of them. There's too much nucleotides used. But anyway, that's all, evidence for biological evidence. That has nothing to do with theology.
Well, it
And,
does.
and what I'm
And let me
saying
tell you.
with now, okay, what I'm saying is that if you look at those non-conserved areas, and we know there are a lot of non-conserved areas uh, all over the genome, right? And if you look at those and you go all the way back to these common ancestors, you go back to the chimp, you go back to the orangutan, you go back to the mouse, to the rat, to whatever, you go back even to the bear, you go to all these outgroups, and you find all of these patterns. Those patterns have to have a cause. And that cause for me is something I have to figure out naturalistically, right? Because just the way, like, if you went out and you saw your garbage can was tipped over and garbage was strewn all over the yard, you would look for a natural cause for it, right? So I'm doing the same thing. I'm looking for a natural cause. Where do I invoke? I mean, I don't care what a creator would have done or how a creator would. None of that means anything to me. I'm looking for the natural cause of how my garbage got strewn all over the yard, right? I'm not saying, oh, how would a creator have strewn the garbage? I don't have to do that.
Right,
And
but
Psi doesn't either.
that is
There you
actually
go.
what you did. If you go back and listen to this later, okay, you can go
Okay,
back
tell me how.
and
Tell me
see what
exactly
you
how I
did
did
when
that.
I said, show me how this is evidence for evolution, right? How is it
Evidence
evidence
for
for
evolution.
evolution? You turned and said, well, because I can't imagine that if there's a designer intelligence or something behind life, that intelligence would put these introns the same in the mouse and the human. And so that is an idea about God or what a creator would do. And
No, I
that
never said
that is
anything
being,
about a
wait, hold on,
creator.
let me finish, that is being used to bolster your observations in favor of evolution, right? So like if you take away that idea and I ask you why is this evidence for evolution? Why, when you look at the mouse genome and the human genome, what about that is evidence for evolution? Can you do that without any theological ideas?
Yeah, the similarity. I'm looking for the cause of the patterns. Every time you see a pattern, there's a cause for that pattern. There's some other pattern that engendered that new pattern, right? And you go back and there's another pattern and another pattern and another pattern. So I'm seeing these patterns and I'm trying to determine what is uh, what is a way for those patterns to happen. And we know about genes and we know about reproduction and copying genes and all that. And that is a way for those patterns to happen. So that becomes evidence for believing what I believe, that we are related to mice, basically, that there was a common ancestor. Okay, I never said anything about a creator. I never said anything about how a creator would do it. You need to listen to this and hear that I never said anything about a creator, and nor did Psi. The old Earth theists or the old Earth evolutionists never talk about how the creator would have done it. We don't care. We don't believe in it. I don't believe in a creator. He does, but he thinks the creator created it a long time ago and it evolved since then. So, I mean, what's the difference? You can pick any part in evolution. We could say, oh, okay, maybe God created primates, those little tiny, shrew-like primates. Maybe God created those. And from those evolved all of us other primates, humans and whatever. I mean, that makes no theological assumption at all. I'm saying that I'm looking for the mechanistic cause, and I look all the way back and I look at molecular biology. And if I can find a mechanistic cause, a plausible mechanism for all this to happen, then I'm good. Then I still believe that we had a common ancestor. When I find something that's way out of kilter, right? Like I said, that histone thing is a little bit strange. There's something going on there. Something like that, then I have to pay attention and I have to dig deeper and figure out how did that happen naturally, right? So I mean, uh, you know what I mean? So I've never appealed to a create. I mean, you read these papers and these people, they're having a fight with creationists, right? When I do my molecular biology and genetics, most of the time I don't think about you guys at all. I'm a lifelong atheist. It never occurs to me. I don't care how God might have done it. But I am interested in okay, so how might God have done those introns? I mean, that is a curious question. I've always wanted to ask you. And I've got other questions about creation and the whole, Genesis story, but that has nothing to do with evolution.
Yeah,
My
and
evidence
those
for
are the kind of
evolution
questions
is
I'm not really
mechanism.
interested in answering on here. I mean, I've already talked to you
Okay.
about
I know
religion quite
you
a
aren't.
lot.
I know you never want to answer your own questions about your idea, right? But you want to pick on us. And you're
Yes,
and you're
I
kind of like
do.
taking this you're taking this whole
And the
religion
reason is
thing.
because people are being taught.
Yeah, they're being taught
Yeah,
what?
the reason that I'm picking on you, sorry, you're breaking up a little bit, so I can't hear if I'm interrupting you or not.
Oh shit. Okay. Uh,
Okay, so I think I'm good to say something, but yes, I'm picking on you. I'm picking on evolution because
mhm,
this is being taught as a fact to millions and even billions of people. And it's
mhm.
an absurd theory and it should not be being taught as, a true idea about reality. So that's why I'm picking on it. And,
That's your opinion.
if you remember correctly, I've spent a lot of time talking to atheists about religion, talking to people about God, and I'm not really interested in doing that anymore. I'm interested in talking to people about God, but you said yourself you're not interested in God. So I don't like to
Uh,
talk to people about God if they're not interested in God.
well, it depends on which God you're talking about. If you're talking about the God that I worship, then I'd be interested in talking about that, but that's different. Uh, okay, so what I don't get is I think you're projecting this religion thing because it isn't important to me how God might have created separate kinds, right? So I don't care about any of that. I don't care about the problem of evil. I don't care about any of that crap. Uh, all I care about is a mechanism. And when I look at mechanism, the biggest one for me is embryology, because I can see when an embryo is created from a genome, I can see that if you just tweak a little tiny few nucleotides here and there, you'll end up with a longer limb, or you'll end up with a bone where there's cartilage or whatever. Those things are all what I call evidence for evolution.
Okay, now
And
this is perfect too. This is perfect, okay? Because this will also illustrate it. What about embryology is evidence for evolution?
the fact that when an embryo develops, it comes from a zygote, which is one cell, right? And then you have the mother's mRNA in there, right? So you have some maternal influence. Within the first week, it all gets replaced with what's in the genome. Okay, and then the cell divides, and then divides again, and divides again, and then the cells out in the periphery, they have different signals, and they slowly start to differentiate, and you can watch it differentiate into organs and bones and limbs and all of that stuff. And if you look at how a fin develops, and then you go and look at how a limb develops, you'll find a lot of commonality, but then you'll find slight differences that perfectly tell you what the mechanism is of creating a limb instead of a fin. Okay, so you can see that. We know that in embryology. We've really delved into that. We studied the zebrafish, and we studied humans, and we studied chickens, and I forget what else, mice, uh, extensively, and we know what the difference is, right? And those differences are just a few differences in those genes and how those genes are expressed. And so that becomes the mechanism for changing from one type of organism into another. And for me, that's good evidence. Why is that not good evidence?
Well, I want to ask you, think about it for a minute because I want to say hi to somebody that I haven't seen in a while. But think about,
Leo.
why is that evidence? Why is that evidence for evolution? But don't answer yet. I have to say hi to Leo. How could good to see you? Haven't seen you around in a while. So, how could evolution be religious? He asks. It doesn't include the systematized worship of a deity through cultural practices and
Yeah.
rituals. True, right? But Leo, you'll have to go back because I don't want to repeat everything I said at the beginning. If you watch the first 15 minutes of this, you'll see what I'm talking about. And I'm not claiming that it's a systematized way of worship of a deity, okay, through practice and rituals. But you'll see what I'm talking about if you watch it. And if you want to have a conversation about it, happy to do that. Okay, Mike, why is what you described with embryology good evidence for evolution?
Because it tells you how things could have happened causally. Hang on a second here. This blood pressure medicine I take makes me cough every now and then. Anyway, so it tells us causally, okay, how an organism can change from one kind of organism into another. So we know the mechanism, right? We can test mechanisms in the lab, and we can mess with those mechanisms and get things to happen. So we know that, right? So that becomes a good evidence for the possibility that evolution is correct, right? Now there
Well,
might
I'm
be
still
other
waiting
things
to
go
hear,
there.
why is that evidence? Why? Like, what
Why
about
is
what
it
you're
evident?
seeing is evidence for evolution?
Okay, oh God, how could I explain this to you? I think you think evidence is going to be proof. Okay, you're
No,
mistaking
I'm
evidence for
I'm not
proof.
expecting it to be proof. I want it to be, I'm just asking why it's evidence. And I
Why
think
it's
you're
evidence for
starting to catch
evolution.
on to this now because you're not going to the religious ideas. I think you're realizing that it's relying on religious ideas. In order to bolster evolution, you have to rely on
No.
religious ideas. Okay. So how is what you described with embryology, how is that evidence for evolution?
Okay, if I want to figure out how a rock formation came to be, right? I have a rock formation and it's folded limestone or metamorphosized limestone, right?
Wait,
And,
we're
and
on
I
embryology. Don't go
oh,
to
okay,
another topic. Okay.
it's so similar. Embryology and geology, so
But why
similar.
are you
This
adding
is
another topic? Let's stick on the embryology because I want to
okay.
understand. You described how embryology for you is evidence. You described what we see in embryology.
Okay.
And I'm
Okay,
asking, how is that evidence for evolution?
my hypothesis is that we came from fish. Basically, that there was a population of fish that led to us, right? Okay. So if that's my hypothesis, so now I have to figure out how did that happen? What would be the mechanism, right? So it would be reproduction, reproduction, reproduction for 300 million years, right? And then I have to look at what is possible. And if in the lab I can show what is possible, that these mutations happen, they happen slowly. We go from one form to another. We go from the fin to a fin with a slightly longer bone that where it can lift up. There's all of these stages. Then all of that becomes evidence for my hypothesis. The evidence for my hypothesis is a plausible mechanism that would allow my hypothesis to be true, right? So now we have a hypothesis, right? And we have evidence for the hypothesis. That's all we got. That's all we got. Why ain't that good enough for you?
Well, I'm
Why is
waiting
that
for
not
the
evidence?
evidence.
You understand? That
So
is
you've given
evidence
me a
for the hypothesis.
hypothesis, but what's the
What do you
evidence?
mean by evidence? What would be evidence for a fin to turn into a limb? What would be evidence?
Well, if you put something that doesn't have a fin in a lab, maybe, it has something like a fin and you wanted to make it a fin and it made itself into a fin. That would be evidence for evolution.
What? You mean you expect To see a fish
Now, see,
evolve
this
into
is
a
where we go
dog?
to the storytelling of long ago and far away. And so again, that's an appeal to a story, but that's not that. I mean, you want me to assume, right? Something has happened that is not testable. So is that scientific or is that, something else? But that's getting off the subject, because what we're talking about is evolution absolutely relying on religious metaphysical ideas in order to keep it, to bolster it, to add the evidence. And I can tell you, even though you're not saying it now, because I think you're actually catching on now to the issue,
No,
but the way
not.
that this usually goes, okay, is that when you talk about embryology, if people will say, oh, well, we see the embryo going through these stages, if you just, it'll like make a body part, and then it'll get sucked back in as if it used to have that body part. It's kind of going through the developmental stages. So, and then it'll be like, okay, well, and so then the answer, well, why would it be like that? If it was designed, if a designer designed, if this was the design, why would that happen? That's the
I
way
don't
this
care
usually
about
goes.
any of that.
So,
I don't care
so
about
it's
that.
usually it relies on a theological argument to bolster it as evidence for evolution. Now, you're not doing that because you're catching on now. But what you're
I'm not
realizing
catching.
is
No,
that
I'm not catching on
wait,
to
hold on,
anything.
hold on. Let me just say this last thing and then you can respond. But what you're realizing is that you're having a hard time saying why it's evidence for evolution. Once you take away that theological idea, you can't use it as evidence for evolution. There's no evidence there.
Yeah, okay. It's evidence for evolution because we can see how something happens, right? Right now, today in the lab, a real small step, right? And then we know of another small step and another small step. And we can extrapolate those small steps all the way back. And we can see how a fin can turn into a limb. And all of that is evidence for evolution. It's evidence for the hypothesis. It tells you that it's possible. It's possible for this to happen. If you want to falsify evolution, you have to show that some step is impossible. Okay, no one
I
has
think that's
done
already
that.
been shown. Yeah, I think it's already been
No,
shown.
no one has done that. You've done this back of the envelope probability BS, but no one has. No one has. Do you have other people in the back room, by the way?
No, I don't.
Oh, you don't. Oh my God, because I got to go pretty quick.
Okay,
But
that's fine. You can go. I mean, look, there's
no.
no.
Oh, you'd like to get rid of
Yeah,
me now
if you've said what you wanted
because
to say.
I'm showing you that there's no theological assumption. I don't care about Haeckel's drawings or limbs being reabsorbed or whatever. All I care about is mechanism. And I know that there is that had I the time, in principle, I could show you the mechanism all the way from the fin to the limb. And that would take a bunch of researchers, but I haven't found anything in those steps that's impossible. And until I do, I'm going to believe that we're still fish.
Okay,
That's
but we're
my
not
bottom line.
talking about what's impossible. We're looking for
No,
evidence
you
that
need
evolution
no
happened, right? So,
evidence for okay. Evidence is every causal step that you can show, every molecular mechanism which we can test in the lab today. Okay, and we take those mechanisms and we have to infer a little bit, right? You do a little inference. Science always infers. Like if you go out in the yard and you find your garbage scattered all over, you're going to infer either teenagers or raccoons, right? You're going to find some cause for it, right? And that's what we're doing. And we have all of these causes and all of this evidence for what caused it, right? What would your evidence be for a garbage can? I mean, okay, if
or a what?
I don't like if your garbage was strewn all over the yard, what would your evidence be that a raccoon did it? Okay, you'd go out and you'd find things chewed on, and plates cleaned and stuff like that, and you say, so you infer that the raccoons came there and they chomped and they ate and they opened your garbage. I mean, that's the way this works. This works all the way down. That evidence goes all the way back in embryology and genetics, and we can see the possibility. And what we're looking for is a way to falsify it, right? We have to find something that's impossible, an impossible step. Okay, otherwise everything's evidence. I mean, uh, and you're right. Some things are evidence, like there's like evidence for God done it. I mean, you can make up anything you want, right? I mean, you don't need a lab. You can just make up anything you want. Like God could have created those introns for the mouse, and then he had like say God had some sort of supernatural pencil, and the pencil was a little bit dull, and he made a few mistakes here and there as he went along. I mean, you can make up anything you want. You can believe that it happened last Thursday, that everything was created last Thursday, and everything becomes evidence for that. So, I mean, evidence for evolution does not mean that it's not evidence for something else, right? At the same time. I mean, it could be, some crazy thing like last Thursdayism, right?
Yeah, and
So,
that's why, I admit I believe a story about our origins. And I'm not trying to say that my
yeah, and I'm
story
not sure if I
is
do.
my what's that?
I'm not sure if I do. I don't know the whole story. I'm working on abiogenesis right now, and I don't know the whole story. So I don't really have any belief about how it happened. Okay. Because I have a lot of I don't know. I'm
Right.
kind of agnostic about that, right? But being if you go to my naturalist philosophy side, right, I have this whole thing over here that tells me, yeah, it had to happen naturally. But I mean, that has nothing to do with my study of evolution or evidence for evolution. Your evidence is really, really naive. That we're going to go in the lab and we're going to create a cell, or we're going to turn a fish into a dog, or any of that. That is just such nonsense. You really need to read more and understand what we're
Well,
doing. I
Mike,
mean, that's
I
just
think
nonsense.
that's nonsense too. I think evolution is nonsense. I don't
I
think
know you
that,
do. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I don't think
Yeah. For some
that,
reason,
that
you're
there's a
stuck on this whole.
mechanism that can cause, and I'll give you the first cell. I don't think that any natural mechanism is able to create the diversity of life on Earth, no matter how much time is given. And I
Yeah.
think that we've demonstrated that in various ways. So, what is
Really?
keeping this theory
How did you
afloat?
do that? How did you do that? How did you
Me
demonstrate? See,
personally, not me
if
personally,
well, okay,
people in
if you
general.
actually did that, Rebecca, Nobel Prize material, you'd falsify evolution. Go
Well,
ahead.
people like
I
to say
invite you.
that, but people like to say that, but, a lot
I
of
mean,
times when people have the right idea about something and that goes against what people have built their careers on, and the people in power have
oh,
built their careers on, then
the
often the
conspiracy
people
theory.
who speak up, you're interrupting me. The people who speak up about it are often silenced, fired, and that's exactly what we see with people who have spoken up for intelligent design. They have been canceled, fired, and, treated as if they're doing something horrible when they're just being honest about the evidence.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay, we can leave it there. But the reason they're
Okay.
fired is because they're incompetent. They're doing
Okay.
incompetent science, and we don't allow for that. We're doing something else. We do serious work in the lab. We don't sit around and do back of the envelope calculations or any of that. The flagellum is so complex it couldn't have happened. No, we don't do that. We do one step at a time, one little molecule at a time,
And
and
see, this is
they get
what I
fired
mean
because
by
it's nonsense.
this is
Uh,
what I mean by they get canceled, discredited, and what you're doing right now is demonstrating that, right? You disagree with their ideas, but so you're
no, not the
attacking
right
them
idea.
and saying basically they're not doing science. Right?
Right.
And so and you're particularly attacking Michael Behe because he's the one who put forward the
Hmm.
flagellum, which is a
Yeah.
very good and powerful argument. And if anybody goes and look at the
Okay.
videos that have been of flagellum and see what's going on there. It's an incredible machine. Michael Behe made a great argument, but instead of actually responding substantively, people just want to dismiss him and say, oh, he's not doing good science.
Because he didn't do the work. He didn't do the work. He didn't go to all the bacteria, all the different types of flagella, all the different types in archaea, in eukaryotic cells. There's many different kinds. He didn't do the work, and that's why he got laughed at, because he didn't do the work. If he wants to do the work, then he's got to go ahead and he's got to come over to our side and try to basically show us what step is impossible. That's what he's got to do. Anyway, we could leave it at that, Rebecca.
All right. Thanks for coming.
I don't understand. I don't understand why you want to die in this Genesis, literal interpretation of Genesis. Seigart and I had a wonderful talk about a different interpretation of Genesis, which I think is really beautiful poetry. And I don't understand why you want to die on this hill, but you go ahead and do that.
I don't want to die on the hill. It's just what
you're going to die on this hill.
All right. So Dave asks a question. He says, is Rebecca claiming that inference is invalid? No, not at all. Actually, I think inference is an important part of doing historical science. When you can't do something, in the lab, when you can't make an actual application in the lab and do it right now, then, inference is needed. So you look back, and I think Mike gave the example, which is a good example of, okay, you see trash strewn in your yard, and how are you going to know what the cause of that was? Can you determine if it was a raccoon? And maybe here's some things you would look for to determine if it was a raccoon. You would see chew marks. You would see, and there might be things that might lead you to think it's a raccoon. But then you have to look at other things. Maybe you don't find a raccoon print. Maybe instead you find a print of some other kind of animal. So you'd compare different ideas, right? And so that's totally valid. I'm not saying that's invalid. And do you want to say something
Bear
about
have a very different way of eating things. They will chew on the cartons, whereas raccoons will lick them. You could tell. Can I make a comment to one of your guests, Frank Hubeny, 958?
Sure.
He's a programmer and Python programmer, so am I. And he expressed an interest in digging into things. And I've invited him. All you got to do is go to that video that I did shooting back on Rebecca's idea about, what was it? I can't remember. Anyway, you know the video I did. I made some snarky remark about Rebecca, as I usually do in my video titles. Anyway, Frank, please go over there, leave a comment. Let's get in touch. Let's do some work on this, because you sound like somebody I can work with. So anyway, Rebecca, I wish you were somebody I could work with, but I enjoyed our talk tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Yep. Thanks for coming on, Mike. And
I'll later.
Bring somebody else on now. Thanks. See ya. Hey, Junior.
Hey, how are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Yeah, so just to comment real quick on the last guest. Yeah, so basically, the usual ad hoc attacks. But does he read? Is he actually up to date? I think he's inside the paradigm, right? Only the evolutionist papers being published, right? Not the actual neutral information, just the neutral information itself, right? Instead, he's like just buying to the evolution story. One thing that Mr. Hunter said a while back, right, about histones. I didn't know that. That was really interesting, actually, about histones. How histones like is 99% in plants and animals, and then the evolutionists predicted that then selection got rid of all, and then it turns out no, histones can actually be mutated quite a bit. Why haven't they? So selection had nothing to do with it. So evolution just decided to change everything, but histones, you're gonna stay the same. Evolution chooses what you're gonna choose the same, you're gonna change it, you know what I mean? It's ridiculous, honestly. I predict that evolution only has like 100 years to go, honestly. People might be surprised of that, but things are happening too quickly in the world, things are happening too fast. Evolution started 150 years ago, and I think he probably has about 100 years to go before it's replaced by intelligent design completely. That's just the
I
reality.
think it might have less than that. I don't think it's going to take that long. The progress that we've made in science in the last 20 years, I feel like, it's not going to be able to hold on for very long. I feel like the most, like, when the people die that, have,
Yes,
like,
yes.
but I mean,
That,
it depends. We'll see. Maybe,
that
maybe I'm just
there's
wishful
actually
thinking. Yeah.
there's actually someone, I forgot who it is. There's actually someone who said that usually you have to wait 2 generations or 3 generations until something big changes in science like that.
Yeah.
And
But
it,
go
and
ahead.
yeah, just to say real quick, yeah, it's like, honestly, the advancements in science and technology of gene sequencing is completely destroying evolution, and it's not now. It's been a while. It's been like 30 years, or about 30 years, something. In the last 30 years, it's been completely destroying evolution with the rise of gene sequencing. Every single prediction is turning out to be completely wrong. Mutations is not evolution. Mutations is just mutations. But evolutionists would like to say that something is evolving, when in reality, no, it's just mutations happening. You can't just say mutations are evolution. Mutations is mutations, you know what I mean? And every single time we see gene loss for these bacteria, there's publications of these people. Look it up. It's gene loss that is
Yeah.
making bacteria and it's making animals adapt to things. It's built-in information. And we have further evidence now with papers showing that evolution can happen only a few generations after the environment changes. Oh, so you're telling me that natural selection, boom, just like that. 3 generations, boom, something new. Sounds like built-in information to me, right? To be able to change that quick. So we see more and more evidence of built-in information, not slow natural selection of mutation, have to fix in a population for a long time. None of that nonsense. Histones, another one that was amazing. I love that. I'm gonna use that as well in debates. The histone, I didn't know about that one. The Cornelius Hunter said. Yeah, and also, what else did we find in the last 30 years? Oh, so you're telling me that science proved that we all came from a single woman? Oh, so you're telling me that science proved that we all came from a single man? Sure, the evolutionist was gonna say, it's just the common ancestor, but still, one woman and one man. What are the chances of that in evolution? It could have been 30 women, 100 random women, you know what I mean? But just one woman survived for some reason, just one man, and they lived at the same time. And I can go on and on, like the fact that all mountains, even evolutionists agree to this, uniformitarian, that all mountains arose at the same time or nearly the same time. The fact that only Earth is the only
Junior,
planet
you're
with...
going to too many different topics here. I want to answer a few comments. Okay.
I'm gonna tie it up real quick.
Okay.
The fact that Earth is the only one with plate tectonics. I wish people could see what's happening here. I wish they could see. Anyway, may the Lord have mercy on these people, because it's so obvious what's happening here. That's it. That's all I wanted to say.
Awesome. Thanks for coming on, Junior.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Okay. Nathan said, most religious people, including most Christians, accept evolution. They just say their God did it. It's the fringe lunatics that claim that they are not compatible. Okay. I'm not saying that you can't be a Christian and accept evolution. Some of my favorite Christians believe in evolution. Some of the best Christians I know believe in evolution. Okay. So I am not saying that these are incompatible. They are compatible. So the reason I don't accept evolution is because I don't think it has the scientific evidence to back it up. Okay. If I did think it did, I would find a way to make my theology work. As it is, my theology works very well by rejecting evolution. Okay. But if I found out evolution was true, then I would work out my theology in such a way that, I could make it compatible. Okay. So I'm not telling anyone they can't believe in evolution and be a Christian. You definitely can. And in fact, I highly recommend it. I don't want anyone to miss out on the best experience that I've had in life, which is knowing God. and being in a relationship with God, experiencing God's love, experiencing God doing cool stuff for me, experiencing his little hellos and the things that he's done in my life that actually make life wonderful. So for me, all my best experiences in life, all of them are involved with God. And so I don't want anybody to miss out on that experience. So I'm definitely not saying they're incompatible. If you must believe in evolution, okay, fine. That's fine. If that's where you really think the scientific evidence leads, then that's fine. Be a Christian who believes in evolution. But it's my personal opinion and belief that I'm sharing on this channel that there's no good reason to believe in evolution, that you are very scientifically justified by reject evolution. So now there's a couple other comments that I thought were really good. So Wesley says, I think you're wrong because it's a theological, metaphysical issue. It's not about evidence. Okay, so what Wes is responding to is when I said, I think evolution might be done in like 20 years because of, the progress we've made in science in the last 20 years. And it's becoming obvious that evolution is false. And he's saying, no, I think you're wrong because it is a theological, metaphysical issue. It's not about the evidence, which is a very good point that goes along well with the whole topic of this stream, that the bolstering of evolution, the strong evidence for evolution is religious. It's based on theological ideas, metaphysical ideas. That's what gives evolution its power. It's not the scientific evidence, which I know when people first hear that, it sounds crazy. Like it just sounds mad. Like, and even to me, it sounded mad. Like I did not understand what Cornelius Hunter was talking about in his videos when he would say religion drives science and it matters. I didn't know what he was talking about. I assumed that he was talking about materialism, that it's naturalism that's driving evolution. That's what I thought. Okay. And then when he was saying, evolution, the core of it is, these religious ideas, I thought, that can't be right. It's like, I noticed those religious ideas coming into play, but I thought at best, that's just a side issue. That can't be the core. And now after reading 2 of his books and thinking about this a lot and interacting with people with this awareness, I have become very aware that the strong evidence for evolution is coming from these metaphysical assumptions. So I see what you're saying, Wes, and you might be right about that. It might be, it doesn't matter what the evidence shows, and maybe it never will. So Laser Fan says, scientists at the lab I'm doing my research at utilize evolutionary assumptions all the time to make molecular biology innovations. Well, I would like to have a conversation with you about that, Laser Fan. I'd like to know specifically what you're talking about, because I think, I hear this idea all the time of like, I know evolution works because I use it in the lab. So when people make that claim, I would like to know exactly what you mean when you say you're using evolution in the lab, because I'm thinking what you mean might be totally compatible with a non-evolutionary scenario, but just things that we know about how biology works that actually don't have anything to do with evolution. So I need to know more about what you're actually saying there. And yeah, so if anybody else wants to join, then come on and join now. If not, I will just close it down. So I'll look at a few more comments while I'm waiting to see if anybody else wants to jump on. So, Sisher, I see this person around, but I don't know how to pronounce this name, but says, Nathan, she always moves the goalposts or slips answering. Really? Do I? Give me an example. When am I moving the goalpost? When am I slipping away from answering? I'm trying to answer directly. Now, if I don't understand a chat message, I can't really answer it. And sometimes it's very hard to communicate at a deep level in the space you have in a chat. So please understand, it's hard to figure out what's going on sometimes. Now, Nathan is giving some examples, which is good. I think he's giving examples of evolution. So let's look at it. Nathan says antibiotics target bacterial reproduction faster than resistance mutations spread. Evolutionary arms race under selection pressure. Okay, so what are you saying about that? So, because yes, we know that bacterial cells can, when they have like some kind of thing going on, they will. Okay, I don't know what you're trying to say here, but I know that some bacteria can, like, if they're in a rough environment, they can like turn on like hypermutate and like try to find something that works better for that environment. And for me, that's just an example of the incredible way that God designed, bacteria to have the ability to do that, to be able to turn that on. That's not an example of evolution. So, okay, we got another taker. You couldn't resist,
Couldn't
could you, Dr.
resist.
Thompson?
I'm
You know
back.
what? Before we jump into whatever you have prepared, I just want to tell you, I was very disappointed in our last conversation.
What?
Yes, because you would not let it go. You were demanding that I accept this common ancestry of wolves and dogs. You were trying to bully me into it, and that's not the first time you've tried to do that. But
Bullying?
you yes,
No.
you made the whole thing adversarial when I actually could have learned from you. Okay, so
I wasn't trying to be adversarial. Where you get that? Oh, I am hurt by such accusations. Look, if I came across as adversarial, I sincerely apologize. It's certainly not what my approach was intended to be. And I have to confess, so I was busy working, and so I jumped on. I scanned around to kind of get a sense of what the topic is here. But backing up to what you were just talking about, if you want to revisit the last conversation. Okay, so you felt that I was adversarial and bullying you into trying to accept that, well, that wolves and dogs share a common ancestor, and that the different breeds of dogs share ancestry as well.
Yes, and so that's the thing is, I was very open-minded on that stream. So you actually could have influenced me in a direction. Okay. But I don't like being pressured into accepting things that I'm not ready to accept. And instead of actually having a good conversation where I could have learned from you, you were trying, and then you were misrepresenting me by saying I was refusing. Like, basically, you were saying, I don't accept common ancestry of dogs and wolves, when I was just saying, I don't know. Okay.
I felt, that you were agnostic to the idea.
Yes,
that's what that means. Yes. And I thought that's how I reflected
you were saying,
your opinion.
I was rejecting it. Okay.
I said that you were agnostic. Maybe I said that you reject it, but I thought I said that you are agnostic to whether dogs and wolves share a common ancestor. And you are also agnostic to whether the different breeds of dogs are actually related to each other. You don't.
Yes, if there's
you don't accept the claim.
If there's a historical reason to think they are, then I accept it. Otherwise, I'm not making the assumption.
Well, that's great. So what do you mean by historical reason? What would that be?
I'm talking to somebody in the backstage. Hold on.
Oh, gotcha.
So I'll just say hi to him because Steve or Estabon is backstage, and I want to talk to him. I'm just going to let Dr. Thompson share a little bit of whatever he wants to share, and then I'll bring you on. So please hang out back there for a minute. So, okay, what was your question?
Oh, that what would be historical? You said that if you have a historical reason
okay.
for. Mhm.
Well, and you mentioned this, but you didn't go into it in depth.
Yeah.
But you're like, hey, we know some of these breeds, we know their history because we, have records of their existence. And so
Right.
if we have something like that for a dog breed, okay, I'm fine with accepting that as, they had a common ancestor.
Okay.
And
So
I
let's-
might even be fine
Yeah.
with accepting more than that. Like I said, I even said dogs and wolves likely had a common ancestor. So I'm not against
Why
that.
do you
I
say
just
that?
don't want to make that
Sure.
assumption.
Now, why
right?
why do you say that? Why do you think that they likely had a common ancestor?
Well,
What do you base that upon?
mostly because a lot of people think that they did. So
What? Rebecca, come on.
and like I said, it's
You're
something
just
I
going to
haven't
accept the
looked
group
into.
consensus?
No, that's
Well,
why.
why do you think people think that? Why do people think that?
Well, because they're very close. They're very genetically close.
I
right?
see. Interesting. Okay.
Yes.
Right.
So
So, do you think that that's good evidence that they shared a common ancestor?
I don't know. And that's why I don't want to say, okay, because this is the same type of evolutionary assumptions.
It's not an assumption.
It is an assumption.
Not really.
It is an assumption.
No,
But I
not
don't
really.
want to cut up on this. It is an assumption.
No, it's not. No,
Okay,
it's
why
an
is that
obvious
not an
consequence of it's the logical conclusion if you have a group that has separated over time and has been breeding separately, that there will be divergence in their genetic makeup, and
Yeah.
that divergence in genetic makeup is predictable to some degree. The degree to which that they are divergent is dependent upon how distant that common ancestor is. That is how we create family trees using genetic evidence within human beings. We do the same thing for breeds of dogs. We also do the same thing for dogs and wolves. It's the same logic.
Okay, the logic may be the same, but it doesn't
Right.
mean that you're making correct assumptions. So like
Okay.
you're assuming and this actually does go along with the theme of let me
Yeah.
bring it to the theme that we're talking about tonight, which
Sure.
is the theological assumptions
Mhm.
that go along with evolution. So your like assumption is that the similarity, right, means that they had a common ancestor. And so
I don't know
I'm
if
not
it's an
starting with
assumption.
that assumption.
Yeah. It is a prediction of common ancestry, that if there was a common ancestor for two different populations of organisms, whether we're talking about two groups of human beings, if we're talking about human beings and Neanderthals, if we're talking about different breeds of dogs, if we're talking about dogs and wolves, especially if you include 1, 2, and 3 things, this is known as the phylogenetic test, right? This is what Aaron Ra has pretty much popularized. That if you have 3 groups of organisms, 2 of them are going to be more similar to each other than the third. There's always going to be an outgroup. We always see this, whether we're comparing within humans, if we're comparing with different kinds of human type organisms, such as Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo sapiens. We're talking about different breeds of dogs, if we're talking about dogs and wolves, talking about dogs, wolves, and coyotes. There isn't necessarily an assumption there. It is an explanation for the pattern that we see in the genetic makeup of all these different organisms, but it's also directly observable from recent historical observations of
Right. And
breeds
I'm
that have
not
emerged
disagreeing
that we
with the
have
recent.
documented evidence for, or lineages of human beings. Like, we can document these things through a historical record, and then the pattern of evidence that we see in front of us, that genetic evidence, fits perfectly with that divergence. And it's the obvious conclusion that one has to draw, that if you have a separate group of organisms, there's mutation that occurs, there's divergence in that genetic signature, and that the more distant that ancestor was, the more divergence there is in the genetic similarity. Those are all just consequences of direct observation.
Okay, so the ones that you have observations for,
Hmm.
I'm not arguing with,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
But the problem comes in is that you are making an assumption of a family tree that goes back to a single common ancestor, right?
So, okay, let's start simply, right? We want to talk about, say, just the breeds of dogs. Because I hear that you have an agnosticism about whether the different breeds of dogs share common ancestry. Is that correct?
Yeah, because
Is
I've
that a fair?
never looked into
I don't
this.
want to bully you
I
into
do not
accepting
care.
that the dogs are all related to each other.
Okay, I think I'm done with this conversation because we're getting back into the same thing, which is you just again trying to sort of pressure me into accepting.
I'm not trying to pressure you. I'm trying to understand your position.
I've already told you because
Sure,
I'm not
you're
making,
agnostic to it, but
I'm not,
like you do accept that there is, if we try to sort the breeds of dogs, they fall into a very specific phylogenetic hierarchy, and that it also that many of those nodes and branches match historical patterns of the human domestic relationship with dogs.
I haven't looked into this at all. And the
Okay, I
problem
encourage
that
you to
I'm
do it.
having, wait, hold on. The problem that I'm having with accepting what you just said
Yeah.
is that in the past, when you've said things and then I go look them up, I often find them not to be true. Okay. So, like you did the thing with the maned wolf and the bush
Yes.
dog.
Right.
Okay. And then when I looked into it, I was like, oh, okay, this is not what, like, it doesn't show what you think it's showing.
That's
Okay.
I totally
So
disagree
the
with you there. I
point
think
is,
that you probably rationalized that I was saying untrue things, but everything that I said was absolutely true. And it absolutely is the case that the bush dog and the maned wolf are more genetically similar to each other than they are to any two other groups of organisms on the face of the planet. It's also absolutely true that there's substantial divergence in their behavior, their morphology, their overall social structure. It is also absolutely true that there are specific orphan genes that are unique to each of those lineages, and that many of those orphan genes, those orphan alleles, seem to be related to that specific differences in morphology. I also showed you evidence
were going further than that. You were trying to get me
the
to
South
admit
American
that they have a common ancestor.
Well, so then the conclusion one can draw is that if the maned wolf and the bush dog share more genetic similarities to each other than any other two organisms on the face of the planet, that they likely they shared a more recent common ancestor than they did with any other groups of organisms on the face of the planet. Same reason why we would say the same thing for dogs and wolves. There's no reason to cut off maned wolves and bush dogs and say, oh, these must be separate ancestry, but we still somehow we say that dogs and wolves share common ancestry. And I get why you don't want to accept that dogs and wolves share common ancestry, even though you say that you're more or less leaning towards that because everyone says it, including other creationists, right?
Okay. So,
but the reason why they say that is because the overwhelming genetic evidence that they are more related to each other than they are to any other two groups of organisms in the face of the planet.
I'm admitting they have genetic similarities.
Yes.
But even though I know stop interrupting me, please. Even though I know that most creationists accept the common ancestry of dogs and wolves, I'm not sure they're right. So I don't want even though lots of people say this, I haven't looked into it. So I don't know whether I should say it is true or not. But you have continually tried to basically bully me into accepting something based on your testimony, okay, which I don't like. All right. And now
it's the scientific consensus.
I'm tired of talking about this. And seriously, like this is so petty to me. Like if somebody tells me, okay, this is like like I said, you have a PhD in neuroscience.
Sure.
You could come on here and give me the knockdown evidence for evolution from neuroscience. Instead, every time you're getting in about dog breeds. What's up with that? So
I think dog breeds and dogs and wolves and the other canids are a fantastic example and illustrate evolution, because that's what you're asking for. I would say that I can talk to you about brain evolution. We can talk about like the underlying similarity of brain organization in the brain circuits that I worked on for my PhD, which is the cortical basal gangliothalamal cortical loop in songbirds, and how that is very similar to the cortical basal gangliothalamal cortical loop that we see in mammals. And then we can talk about the common origins of those things. But like, first of all, then there's a lot more speculation about those things because it is largely speculative. I would argue that, and I totally agree that evolution is a historical science, that there are going to be assumptions built into some aspects to evolutionary science. That's okay, because it is a historical science. It is a historical science, which means we have to look at the pattern of evidence that we see in front of us, and we need to have some mechanistic explanation for explaining that pattern. I think that that's also true whether you also are going to say that there is separate ancestry and that these things were created. I don't think that that's a theological thing either, because that separate ancestry doesn't necessarily mean that that was a supernatural origination. Like, you could have a natural origination of separate ancestry, couldn't you, on Earth?
Yes.
Sure. Right. So why is that a theological assumption?
Okay. So how is, you see the similar chord or whatever, you see that, and how is that evidence for evolution?
Wait, the similar what?
You
oh,
were
the
talking about
brain
neural
circuits that I was
cord.
talking about.
Yeah.
Sure. So, okay. The origination of, look, it would have to be a separate stream because there's a lot to describe, because I have to explain what the cortical basal gangliothalamal cortical loop is, and then the way it's organized in the bird brain versus is in the mammalian brain. Then we'd also have to talk about overall vertebrate brain organization, the fact that virtually all vertebrate brains are structured in exactly the same sort of pattern, all vertebrate brains. Which
Why is that evidence for evolution?
Because of the common ancestry of all vertebrates. And that, like, we have the origination, you can compare invertebrates and vertebrates, right? There are these two big categories. We got the protostomes and the deuterostomes. And the nervous system organization of the deuterostomes versus the protostomes is that, like, okay, those the common ancestor likely of those organisms had probably some kind of basic neural net, but before there was the origination of a central nervous system, it is likely the case that in these two big groups, which of course the genetic evidence supports this as well, deuterostomes and protostomes, that's where central nervous system organization evolves separately in both of those organisms, and one is ventrally located and one is dorsally located. So in the deuterostomes, it is dorsally located. That's us. So we have a dorsal origination of our overall nervous system. In the protostomes, it is ventrally located. So we're talking about the invertebrates. They have a ventral origination of their overall nervous system. And there's discussion about, like, how there was this inversion event of the early embryo, that must explain why there was this inversion that occurred. I mean, I these are all papers that I've read a long time ago. Again, a lot of this is not, I think, the best, strongest evidence for evolution. I think the best, strongest evidence for evolution is looking at more recent events, such as the evolution within canids. Or if you don't want to talk about canids, I mean, we can talk about other groups of animals. Talk about bears, if you'd like. We can talk about the rodents. Like, I had a big, long discussion with, I forget his name, but he's at the Institute of Creation Research. Burgum was his name, Jerry Burgum, right? And we talked about rodents and the 2,000 different species of rodents and the different families of the rodents, and that the genetic evidence of them having this, like, very clear phylogenetic pattern. But you have to then explain how you get 800 different species of one specific family of rodents from, well, 4,400 years ago off of the ark, which is what, like, is the main position that's taken from the creationist side. Now,
so
how do
again,
you explain
you're
the pattern?
using,
That's the thing.
You're
the pattern,
using a different idea to bolster the evidence for evolution.
It's not bolstering the evidence for evolution. It's shooting down the creationist argument that it's basically like, what is the pattern of evidence? And I think the separate ancestry versus common ancestry model of the paper that you talked about at the beginning is a really great example of this, because there's no reason to think that the parts of the genome that don't really code for anything should be more similar in organisms that are unrelated to each other, that are separately created, is what I mean. If they're separately created, why would that junk DNA be, like, more similar to each other? And that junk DNA follows that phylogenetic pattern. Like if you look at the
This
junk
is
DNA
perfect.
of, yeah.
This is
So
a perfect example for those who are watching of the theological basis
there's nothing
of
theological
the
about that.
evidence for evolution. I know you don't think there is.
Why?
I
What's
know
theological
it's
about
going to
that?
take a while to get this because it went over
Okay.
my head. It went over my head. I
All
was
right.
not getting this for a long time, but now I'm seeing it clearly. Okay.
Why is that theological?
It's theological because you are appealing to what separate ancestry would look like. And
Yes.
how would
It's
you
the
get
competitive
an idea?
hypothesis.
How would you get an idea about what separate ancestry would look like? How do you get that?
If separate ancestry, and especially if we're talking about separate ancestry of that had a cause, for instance, right? Like if it was purposefully created, that would suggest that the genetic sequences have some sort of purpose, right? Now,
theological assumption.
Why is that
That's a
theological?
theological assumption.
Why is that
You're
theological?
making an assumption. That's a metaphysical assumption.
It's not a metaphysical assumption.
Yes.
I mean, it is an assumption. I don't know if it's metaphysical.
It is.
No, why?
It's
Because that could be naturally done, right? You could have aliens show up on Earth, make the separate groups of organisms for whatever purpose that they did it, right? The different kinds, if we want to call them that. They could show up and do that physically. They built a lab someplace, probably in the Middle East, of course, right? Since that's where apparently all the amazing things happen. And they physically made the different groups of organisms, and then there was divergence within the kinds. What's metaphysical about that?
Because you're making an assumption. The assumption you made is that there would have to be a purpose, right, for it to look a certain way.
Sure.
Right.
Okay.
So that is an assumption. How could you test that?
How could you test that?
How could you test the idea that
purpose.
something would have to have a purpose if that's the way it was created, whether by aliens, God, whoever?
Why does anything get created? Like when we look at human design, there's always a purpose for it, isn't there? And when we look at animals doing design in nature, there's a purpose. Like when the honeybee colony makes the hive, there's a purpose behind it. That's design.
Okay.
Isn't it? Yes.
Yes, but
so there is purpose. So then if there is some sort of creators, multiple designers, there would have to be a reason for it, wouldn't there?
Okay. So now, but
that's the point of design.
Yes. And what I'm saying is what you're doing right now is you're tapping into a theological idea because you're saying the way that you're bolstering your evidence for evolution is you're saying, I look at this and I can't see why it would be designed that way. Therefore, it wasn't designed.
It's not theological for me to look at this pen and realize that it probably has a purpose and that whoever designed this had a reason why they designed it. Would you argue that that's theological?
I would say that you're making a good inference and you should probably do the same with the hand that's holding that pin.
What? Really? Okay.
The hand that's holding that pin is way more fantastic than that pin. And you're assuming that pin is designed and it has a purpose. And your hand is so much better than that pin.
The evidence that this is designed. Okay, so then we have to find evidence, right? Evidence that this is designed. So if I want to know that this is designed, how would I go about knowing that this is designed? Other than just like how fantastically it is made. I could go and look to see who designed it. I could look for evidence on the package that I bought it in, see where it was made. I can draw up a mechanism of how it was designed. I can then go test that mechanism by going to the factory and watch it actually being designed. Those are good reasons to know that this is designed. Not that it's irreducibly complex or some stupid reason, or that that there was a tornado in a junkyard and that this just got self-assembled. That is stupid. There are better lines of evidence to know that something like this was designed, which is it shows that it was designed. It was made by someone, that I can show a specific mechanism that this thing was designed. I can show the process by which it was made. You can't do that for my hand. Can you?
Well, but I can give you good reasons to think your hand is intelligently designed. And I agree with
But
what
none
you're
of them are as
saying.
good as the reasons that I have for this. None of them are. Zero. I have much better evidence that this was designed by an intelligent designer than this, right? Would you agree with that?
Totally disagree, but
You
we can have
disagree
that conversation another time because
like, there's better evidence that this originated by chance than this.
yes.
Oh,
definitely.
really? So like there's no
definitely,
factory where I can go see this being made.
There's somebody
Okay.
waiting
Rebecca,
backstage that's been
my
there
God.
for a while.
All right.
No, I am dead serious. And
Yeah.
anyway,
Okay.
I hope for better conversations with you, Dr. Thompson.
Sure. All right.
Okay.
Good luck.
Thank you. Hey, Steve. Estabon, Steve, how you doing?
Hi, fine, and you?
Good, thank you. Thanks for coming on.
Oh, the pleasure is mine. What do you want to talk about? I want to talk about evolution. I want to talk about how species evolve. Well, I want specifically to talk about, well, how we know evolution is true and why we have directly observed it.
Okay.
So
Go
let's
for it.
begin. Let's begin. So I'm going to be brief. I'm not going to take my time because, well, I'm going to have my dinner. So, yeah. Basically, the best evidence for evolution that we have today is actually observing evolution in microorganisms like single-celled yeast. As you know, single-celled yeast are, well, single-celled. So naturally, when, well, these experiments show that these yeast cells can not only group together, but they can through many generations, they showed that the yeast not only stuck together, but they actually grew from a single individual. And instead of separating the cells, it became a single structure, a complex structure that had different mm, tasks for each cell, a complex structure that had a different genetic makeup from the original yeast, and it also had different properties. So it grew to such a size, like 5 times bigger than the single celled yeast, to the point where it was visible to the naked eye. So we got to see evolution right in front of our eyes in just a few generations. In fact, I think it's like 50,000 generations of yeast evolution, where we got from one cell to a complex network, something that is akin to a mycelium, but instead of being, well, a complex mycelium underground, it's, well, in a test tube, you know?
Okay. So, you've told me a story about how you believe evolution happened, but I'm not really seeing so yeast have the ability to group together. We know that about yeast, which is why we like to do those experiments on them, right?
Yep.
So they already have that ability. So, and the same with algae, right? So
Yep.
so that really isn't showing me evolution. That's showing me that there's a certain type of organism, and it has the capability of living as a single cell on its own, and it has the capability of living in a group. So that's an ability it already has. So what is the evolution?
Well, that's a common counter for that argument, which I see made all the time by creationists. But what I know is that what these cells did was not just clump together, they actually grew from a single cell. You typically see when they group together that they do so only in specific conditions, and then after those conditions pass, they separate again and become, well, single organisms again. This was not the case in the snowflake yeast. They actually became they actually grew from a single individual, so all of the cells in that clump, in that structure that formed, were genetically identical to each other. So they did not clump together, they grew from a single individual, like an embryo grows from a single cell, for example, zygote. And also, the difference is that in the experiment, when they changed the condition, what they did was introduce a predatory ciliate, I think, if I remember correctly, which placed selective pressure on those yeasts to, well, to grow and not separate. Instead of separating into single cells, to stick together.
Right.
So one cell divides into many, but instead of dividing into all of, instead of separating, of doing cytokinesis, cytosynthesis, I don't know how to pronounce it in English well, they stuck together and formed a more complex structure. And what it did, instead of being, once the predator was, so okay, let's begin with this. This provided an advantage over other organisms, over the other yeast cells that did not have this feature. So what
Yeah.
it did was place a strong selective pressure that eliminated most of the single cells and only let those that were large to stick together. So what we see is very different from just single cells clumped together. This was a single cell that multiplied. Instead of separating, it stuck together. And once they took the predator out, the ciliate, I think it's another single-celled organism, if I remember correctly. If I'm wrong, tell me. I don't know. Um, the cells stuck together, and no matter how many generations passed, that multicellularity stuck. So they did not just stuck together and then separate. They stayed that way because there was a genetic component,
Yeah.
a genetic change in the population that was inherited and allowed and passed on from generation to generation, even after the predator was gone. So, yeah, that's pretty much the definition of evolution. The change of the inheritable traits of a population over generations. That is evolution.
Yeah, and you know what? That definition of evolution, I have no problem with. I believe that, right? So, but the question is, what kind of change? Because the definition of evolution that I'm challenging is the idea that life diversified by natural processes from a common ancestor. Okay. So,
Yep.
what you've just told me, and those were interesting experiments. There was one with the algae and one with the yeast. And it's been a while.
Same
It's
thing
been like
occurred.
a few years since I've read those, but I do know that what you're saying is true about, they grouped together, they, formed like a multicellular group and they stayed that way. So I
Not
don't know
only
about
that,
I don't know about for how many generations, okay? But I at least the grouping together and staying that way, I know that's true.
not just that.
Okay.
They grew to enormous sizes. The cell morphology changed. The properties of the multicellular groups became very different from what they originally were. They became as tough as wood.
Oh,
So they formed a complex network of cells that was not only very different from from their single celled ancestors they looked, and they had different properties.
right.
They had massive morphological and, well,
Yeah.
structural and all of those changes that occurred in just a few years. I think
Yeah.
it's 5 years.
And you know what? That kind of stuff happens all the time, and so the like there's incredible plasticity within animals. And so, animals that can change according to their environment.
Oh,
But
yes.
so the question is, how are they changing? Are they changing because of mutation and natural selection, or are they changing because of the incredible abilities that God gave them, that are in their genetics and in their cells, that allow them to
Oh,
adapt to their environment? And that's what I would say happened with the yeast, with the algae, and with the other examples that one might give about major changes that happened, that happen, is that what we're finding out, the more that we look into this, is that there are intentional changes happening that allow the organism to live. So that's something that the organism already possessed,
Oh,
right? An ability that they already possessed. Now,
can I ask you?
but they changed forever. And there's things I could do to my body right now to change my body forever. If I became a bodybuilder, I could change my body and make it stronger and make it, tough and do things that would change my
Yes.
body forever. And in fact, it might even change my hormones. It might change my genetics. There's a lot of stuff that I could physically do to myself.
Here's
that
the
would
thing.
change me forever.
Okay, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
How would you know if these changes are epigenetic or if they're evolutionary? They're genetic.
Yeah, well, that's something that we have to study, right? So we can't make assumptions about it. We shouldn't make assumptions about it.
They have a
It's something that we should
study there.
Okay, and so what are you saying? What conclusion are you making from our studies?
I recently read the paper that studied the yeasts after that evolution, well, that event, and they found out that its whole genome had duplicated. It was amazing. Well, there were changes, there were mutations to the genome that caused those structural morphological um, arrangements. Also, the growth of the cells was different. All of that was genetic. We can know this because we can look at the genome of the non-multicellular yeasts and the multicellular yeasts, and we count those we see the differences, and we know that there are differences in genes and how those genes interact to create a new phenotype. So what we found out, well, I didn't find out anything. Well, the scientists found out is that there was a whole genome duplication of the larger yeast, and apparently it was a selected for feature because it it has to do with its bigger size. So it was not an epigenetic change because epigenetic changes don't alter the genome in that way. They Okay, there are changes that in traits, well, there are changes in the genome that can alter the plasticity of individuals, of species. But those changes, we know they are still genetic based. There are genotypes, there are genes that confer more plasticity to individuals than others. So genotypic plasticity is also related to genetic changes.
Cool. Do you mind me asking, what is your background? Like, are you studying biology? Are you a biologist?
I am studying biology. I'm doing my thesis in molecular biology. Well, my well, yeah, I still not graduated, but still, my thesis is in circular RNA production. And well, my background is in many areas of biology. I'm not an expert yet, but I think I can handle myself better than the average person. Still, I'm studying right now.
Okay, cool. Well, I mean, there's a lot of open questions in biology, as you know, about what's actually going on with epigenetics and, with mutations and directed mutations. And so I guess I don't know if I'm really like I want to get to the core. What's the heart of what you're trying to express that you want me to understand about evolution?
Well, that it's simple. Evolution is not universal common ancestry. It's not a giraffe evolving um, from a single-celled organism. That is an observation. That is a conclusion that scientists acquired from evolutionary thinking. But evolution itself is just a change in the inheritable traits of populations. That includes mutations, natural selection, genetic drift, gene flow, all those are evolution. And we know evolution is true. Even if universal common ancestry wasn't true, we know evolution is true because we have observed it in real time in the lab. And also in our crops, well, we got maize. Maize evolved from a wild ancestor we call Teosinte. Of course, that evolution was directed by humans, but it's still very different genetically from its wild counterpart. So we know evolution is true, and we use it for, well, agriculture, for medicine, for many applications. So you may deny universal common ancestry, but what is true is that evolution is, well, a reality, even if we didn't have universal common ancestry, like even if all life was created by God and all of that, we would still have evolution as a result of that creation. That wouldn't change the fact that evolution is still occurring.
Yeah, and this is where we kind of need to nail down what we mean when we say evolution, because I agree that genetic drift happens. I agree variation within animals, and that can variation that happens through reproduction, and even I believe in direct. I think we observe directed mutation, epigenetics. There's that all of these things can change an organism, right? So if we're just talking about those types of changes in organisms, then you and I are not in a disagreement. You're calling it evolution. I'm calling it, things that God put in place. So it's just we you might call it that, but we really accept the same thing. And I would agree with you that you can kind of track that. It's something that you can test. You can, you can see changes in populations. So we have no disagreement there. But the thing that I'm challenging, and it doesn't just have to be universal common ancestry, because, I agree there could be, evolution from, a forest of life, a few maybe, separate like a few different life forms that sprang up, and it didn't have to be from a common ancestor. So we're also in agreement on that. But where we have the disagreement, I think, and what I am challenging is the idea that natural processes, right, could create these fantastic systems that we see in life, that could put eyes together, that mutations plus natural selection could put together hearts and lungs and eyes and feet and all of these features of life, and photosynthesis. And photosynthesis is so complicated and so efficient that we can't even completely figure it out yet. Okay. But we think
It's pretty
that
cool.
came about by natural processes of mutation and natural selection. That's a crazy idea. Right.
Well,
So that's where our difference is.
I think that what what we have shown, what we have seen in experiments, is that amazing complexity can arise from relative simplicity. Like, the cells that I told you, the yeast, they grew to become highly complex networks that were interacting with each other. They had even basic rudimentary differentiation of cell labor. They devote some cells to reproduction, the rests are for different purposes. And what I see there is the potential of just slight mutations, changes, and selection. And that was only in like 50,000 generations, and that was in the span of 5 years. Imagine, well, don't imagine that. I think that if that can be achieved in just 5 years, what directional selection can create in just a few hundreds of thousands, even a million years, you could see basically simple photoreceptor cells become nigh. That's not a huge barrier if we can get such a great complexity in just 5 years. But let's stop at that because it's a complex topic, and I don't think it can be covered in a simple conversation. I think it has to be done in a lab. So what I want you to see is, well, what I want you to go back to is the example with dogs and wolves. You know, dogs and wolves are obviously very different. A Great Dane, a Chihuahua, and a wolf have virtually nothing in common if you look at them at a first glance, obviously. But they have the genomes. Well, their genomes are practically identical. If you look at a dog, like a Chihuahua and a wolf, they have about as many genetic differences as two distantly related people have. Like an African person and a Chinese person have about as many differences at the genome level as a dog and a Chihuahua. If we can get such a, oh, okay, continue.
No, it's just I'm getting really tired of this dog thing because
Yeah.
okay, this I have not looked into dogs. I don't care to look into dogs. Okay, I prefer to just stay agnostic on this issue, but it seems like it's really important to certain
Well,
people to get me to accept the common ancestry of dogs and wolves. Now, for the record, I think they probably did have a common ancestor. Okay,
sure.
the gray wolf or whatever it is and domestic dogs probably did have a common ancestor. But I'm trying to rid myself of assumptions that cannot be demonstrated. Okay. So I don't want to start with that assumption. And
Oh, we all make assumptions.
okay, but I don't prefer to make that assumption. Okay. So that's, but for some reason, this seems to be important to people. But can you tell me what your point is about the dogs?
My point is that such a massive morphological difference can be achieved by just tweaks in a few genes, differences in regulation, especially regulation of genes. It really does not require even new information, as you would call it, or that new information does not arise genetically. It arises as interactions from the regulation of genes. So we can definitely see that evolution does not require like huge genetic changes. It only requires small changes, even to the regulation of genes, and just a few genes that are related to development. And that's the key here is, and the key that here is that, well, if we can get a Chihuahua from a wolf, what's stopping evolution from getting something that looks like a chimpanzee to something that looks like a human?
Okay, yeah, I'll tell you. And that is, you're right that there's a lot of potential for morphological differences, right? Like in the genetics of dogs, right? There's a lot of potential for morphological differences. There's a lot of potential for morphological differences in humans, right? We have very short people, we have very tall people, we have very thin people, we have very wide people. So there's a lot of potential for morphological differences. But that is not evidence for evolution. Okay. In my mind, anyway, I
What
know
does
it is.
evolution require? What does
So
evolution require?
evolution requires everything to be built, everything except the first cell to be built by chemical and physical processes, undirected chemical and physical processes. That's what evolution requires.
Yep. And that's how we get changes in size, in height, in all of those morphological and even some anatomical differences between species. We get them from chemical interactions, from, well, they are not built from the ground up. They're just variations of what already exists.
And that's the point, is that at some point, evolution has to build stuff. But all the examples you're giving me with dogs, with algae with yeast. Okay, that is all of those things you said, oh, they made these major changes in 5 years. Yeah, but they made those changes based on what is already present. Okay, based on what they already had. And so, at some point, evolution has to stop just moving stuff around, and it has to
True.
actually build stuff.
But how far back do you have to go to get that? Do you know that you share most genes with a housefly, right? Or you share basically all of your anatomy, all of your or morphology, well, not morphology, but most of what makes you you with a chimpanzee. There are really no things added to us except for, bigger brain. No, the bigger brain is not an addition, it's just a change. How the brain works, how the brain grows, but it's still the same brain, it's still all of the same organs, it's still all of the same things. So yeah, you're not adding anything new. In fact, if you look at a mouse and a human, there's really nothing new in
There's
us.
nothing there's nothing different between a mouse and a human.
No, there's difference, but there's nothing that is added to us.
Well,
That is completely added.
I think you need to keep
Brand
working
new.
on it, biology, because that is not true. There's so
What
much.
is added?
I agree with you that there are genes that are very similar in, we have shared genes with other organisms, right? But there's a library of difference between a mouse and a human.
Yes, there are differences, but those differences are mainly changes in proportions in anatomical structures, but they're not brand new things that are completely novel. For example, you look at the mouse, it has all the same bones, it has all of the same organs, it has all of the same features that a human has, just differently modeled.
And now we're getting to the point of the stream. I'm glad you brought that up. So, why is having those same features evidence for evolution?
It's not.
Okay.
What I mean is that in order to get evolutionary changes for the to get to a human, you don't from something that was like an ape, you don't need to add completely new, I don't know how to say it, but things that completely did not exist. They're just modifications of things that already exist in other apes. And even if you extend that far back, you get the same things in a mouse, you get the same things in a lizard. There are few changes, yes, but most of it, evolution does not have to create. It's just changes. And when we look at yeast, that same principle happens. You didn't add brand new things. The yeast, you change. Well, evolution changed how it organized, but it's the same quote unquote information.
Okay, but can you see that at some point evolution actually does have to create and build? So you start with one
Yes.
cell, a single-celled organism. Now,
Yes.
how do you get to you? That
It's a
without
very
building,
long process,
right? Without building, you have to create. There has to be
Yes.
there has to be a chemical and physical process to get to you, and that's the process I'm challenging. I'm saying
Mainly a
when
physical
we
process.
when we look at when we look at animals in the lab, we don't see them being able to make those kind of changes. And the evolutionary story is, oh, well, you see, it's so long ago, it takes so much time that you wouldn't be able to see it in the lab. Well, then why are we calling this a scientific theory if it's not something that if it's just something we're telling a story about the past? Why are we calling this a scientific theory and saying there's scientific evidence for it?
Lots of things in science don't have direct observation, but we have indirect evidence of them. Of course, evolution has assumptions, but evolution is the best explanation for many of those observations. You don't
What makes
need to.
evolution the best explanation?
Excuse me, what's the question?
You said evolution is the best explanation for many of those questions. What
Observations.
makes evolution the best explanation?
Evolution is the best explanation because we have observed it. We know what its mechanisms are. We know how it works. We have many pathways that are plausible for how things change. And we have seen many of those changes in living organisms. So we know how evolution works. We know what it's capable of. And so when we look at those same patterns that we observe in evolutionary experiments, but throughout the rest of organisms of the entire planet, we get to see a very strong concordance. So that's why evolution is the best explanation, because it's a real process that we can observe, that we have good evidence, that we have mechanisms for, that we know how they work, that we know how they can produce innovation, that we know how, and we have observed those changes in laboratory experiments. So yeah, evolution is as far by far the best explanation that we have for biodiversity on this planet.
Okay, well, we agreed about certain processes, but we agreed about the processes that organisms already have the ability, like that they already have the ability to use for change, right?
Yes.
But what are the processes that are getting organisms to build new genes, for example?
Oh, there are many. But one of my favorites, well, my favorite, of course, is gene duplication. Of course, you may say that's just copying information that already existed, of course. But gene duplication causes, well, copies of a gene that can mutate and change their function. Of course, they have you have one gene that produces one protein, then that gene accidentally gets duplicated, and in that duplication, you have two copies of the gene, and that can provide an advantage to the organism. So, oh, when one of the copies mutates, the other is left there. So there's no harm to the organism if one of the copies mutates, and if that mutation causes a novel protein fold or a novel protein interaction that can provide a new advantage to the organism, that can be selected for. And that selection over time, more mutations accumulate to that protein. You get a novel protein, a novel fold from what once was a duplication of a gene. Now you got a new gene.
Can you give me an example of that happening that like we've observed in a lab?
Well, I can provide you an example of a duplication of a region in E. coli. Well, I'm sure you've heard this, the SID plus variant of E. coli. Well, that of course it's not neofunctionalization, but it's a great example. Oh, someone says, say citrate, please. Yes,
Yeah,
citrate.
Mr. Green, you got your wish. You got your wish.
Yes, citrate. Yeah, it's a duplication of a gene that got transposed into a region that was activated under a different promoter. So the new duplicate allows the E. coli strain to metabolize citrate not just in anoxygenic but in oxygenic conditions as well. Now that is of course not a full process of neofunctionalization, but that is a perfect example of a duplication that causes a novel trait. And of course, I need to go into more examples. Oh,
Well, but let me stop you on that example real quick. And by the way, there's two people waiting backstage, so we'll kind of have to wrap up
we'll
in a minute.
wrap up. Yes.
But I'll let you have the final word. But I'll with this, metabolizing citrate example with E. coli, are you aware that that experiment has been duplicated several times?
Yes.
Okay, so we first thought it was an amazing example of evolution that they gained this new ability to metabolize citrate in, I guess, an anaerobic environment. I can never remember if it's aerobic or anaerobic that they didn't have the power to do. But anyway,
it was originally anaerobic. They couldn't metabolize citrate in oxygen, when in the presence of oxygen, and then they became able to metabolize it
thank
in
you.
oxygen.
Awesome. Okay, thank you. So so we thought this was an amazing example of evolution being able to innovate, right? But some other researchers repeated it and found that the E. coli did the same thing again. So, and then again, and then again. So basically the what that shows us is that the E. coli actually have the power to manipulate at whatever level this happens. When it's needed, they are able to make themselves do that to metabolize citrate in
not
the
exactly
environment. So that's not an example of evolution by random mutation and natural selection. It's an example of the power that the E. coli already have to adapt to their environment.
You know how that would work? How would they adapt? How would they do that?
Yeah, it's like there's a gene. I know there's like an amplification, or there's 2 steps involved in that process. But
there's a
if you know the
duplication
details, tell
of
me.
a gene. That duplication got transposed into a different promoter. That's how
Okay,
it evolved.
cool. Nice.
So that's funny because, well, organisms can't do that consciously. They can do that in response to their environment. Of course, there are ways by which metabolic routes can be activated in the presence of certain environmental pressures, of course, but that's not what happened. For example, the lac operon, which is a region of DNA that is controlled by an operator. Several genes are controlled by a single operator, I believe. That's what an operon is. It is activated by the presence of lactose. So lactose binds to a protein that is a transcription factor, I believe, that suppresses the activation of the lactase enzyme. So when lactose enters in contact with that enzyme, with that protein, I mean, with that transcription factor, it releases from the DNA and begins transcribing that lactase enzyme. That is an epigenetic change, but that's not what happened in the E. coli experiment. It was a duplication of a gene, which we know no epigenetic mechanism that can do that. So
Right,
yeah,
but
that's
we
what.
know that even if we don't know the mechanism, we know that it is repeatable. So we know
Yes.
that under the same conditions,
Evolution can be repeated. Convergent evolution is a thing.
Well, that's a matter for an entirely different day, because
Yep.
convergent evolution is a contradiction to evolution. So that's a patchword used to fill up the holes when evolution is contradicting itself.
Why do you say that? One last thing. Why do you say that? Okay.
Because what is often used as the support for evolution, okay, is the similarities between organisms, right? Like, oh, look, these same features, these, make it obvious that there was a common ancestor. But what happens when we have a similar feature, but it's on the wrong branch of the evolutionary tree? Well, then we have to make up a word called convergent evolution to make it all okay.
Oh, but it's not just the
other
same
words to
feature.
make it all okay too. But it's a contradiction.
May I explain that a little bit?
Yes, but can you do it within
I will
2
wrap
minutes
up.
so I can
I
let
will
the
wrap
next
up.
person on? Okay.
So we say that it's convergent evolution when you have the same trait in totally different organisms, but that is quote unquote the same trait, but it's just a similar trait that does the same thing, and it's made by a different genetic component. So, for example, when you have two strains of E. coli that you place under selection to do a certain thing, and they achieve the same thing, the same evolutionary change, and you look at the genetic routes, you will not find the same genetic pathway most of the time. You will find different genetic pathways to achieve the same result, the same evolutionary change. So you can say that this is convergent evolution. If you have the same genetic pathway in both to do the same, you would say, well, that's by common ancestry. But if you have different genetic pathways that arose independently, you can say that that's convergent evolution. One great example of this is thylacines and dogs or wolves. We say that they're convergent evolution because they look very much alike and they acted the same way, but the genomes of both of them were very different and the traits did not correspond to the same genetic changes. So, yeah, that's basically the distinction that we make.
Yes. And I'm going to let you have the last word on that. That way, like I would prefer to let you have the last word. So thank you for sharing. And thank you for
Thank
coming
you.
on. It was a pleasure talking to you. So please come back anytime.
Of course I will. Thank you.
Okay.
Oh, I'm laser fan, by the way.
Oh, you're laser fan.
Yep, I didn't put my
Nice. Okay. Yeah. See, sometimes if somebody's name is different, I'm not going to connect you unless you tell me. So thank you
No,
for
I
telling me.
wanted to tell you that. Yes.
Good, good. Okay, well, definitely I recognize you by laser fan. So yeah, thanks for letting me know.
Yes,
Appreciate
thank
coming
you.
on. Okay. Take care.
Good.
Hey, XO.
Hey, Rebecca. Baruch Hashem. How you doing tonight?
I'm great. How are you?
Awesome. Thanks. Yeah, thanks for letting me on here. I just want to say it's happy to hear that you have this ability to make sure that you don't stay with the consensus and kind of like the dogma of certain groups. Because I noticed that, certain people keep wanting to tell you what other people think, right? They always want to say, well, these creationists say this, or they even admit to that, because that's their go-to, is to make sure that you stay within their parameters. So it's really good to know that you're not allowing them to put you in their category. So congratulations. And if your Lord and Savior decides that you're going to surpass all men, Rebecca, that's not a problem, right? I mean, sometimes God, uses his children to do certain things that other people just can't handle. And I think what you're doing is great, because let's be honest, most channels, most people that do these kinds of discussions are kind of set in their ways, and they're, let's be honest, even, theists are very egotistical in what they do. So it's nice to see that you're open to understanding that you might have, certain understandings and different levels of knowledge that maybe they don't. But I did want to talk about, besides the obvious, the dog guy. Is that what his name is now? Because we're not allowed to talk about dogs anymore, right?
Yeah, Dr. Thompson. Mm-hmm.
Dr. Thompson, yeah, he was the same gentleman that was on the other day, right? And he kind of said something that, I'll be nice, but what he said was not necessarily true. And I looked into it just to see if he made up the claim, and it seems that he did, because nobody else is making that claim that any magical dog now has new genetics that didn't already exist, because everybody knows that they get their genetics from the mommy doggy and daddy doggy, and that's just how it works. But I wanted to point out that natural selection is another one of these deceptive terms. And when you look on the internet and you type in natural selection, which we can agree on, that let's say natural selection is a thing, that doesn't mean evolution is a thing. And that's where the deception works. See, natural selection actually disproves evolution. And it's this simple. Natural selection selects from what already exists, and it's absolutely impossible to do anything other than that. So it's quite opposite of evolution. It will only allow, if there is such a thing, and there's some reasons why it's actually more of a fantasy as well. There's really no such thing as natural selection, because when certain animals that I've raised, sometimes the fittest die first, if that makes sense. The strong men go out to war, Rebecca. It doesn't mean that they were the weakest. It means that they were the strongest. And when you go out to war, you might die faster than the little babies and the little weaklings, or some of the invalids that stay behind. So this idea that, the strongest survive is actually another fantasy. What are you talking about? David was a little boy. Just read the Bible, right? He became a great king, but that's, when he defeated Goliath, perfect example of a little kid doing amazing things. But natural selection here, and it says in the Webster's Dictionary, a natural process that results in the survival and reproductive success of individuals or groups, they want to leave their definition open, best adjusted, this is weird, adjusted, so they're a little bit loose on that adaptation claim, adjusted to their environment, and that leads to the perpetuation of genetic qualities best suited to that particular environment. Well, that's a lot of words, right, Rebecca? But we know in reality, the creatures are already alive. And if they stay alive, that's because they already had the ability. And if they don't survive, that certainly isn't going to help any form of natural selection that has anything to do with evolution. So if they are selected naturally, then they're going to be selected because they already have the ability to survive. Even if they change, like I'm not identical to my mother and father, that's not probably the best example. I'd like to stay in nature. And you'll notice all of these gentlemen that we speak to, none of them can even attempt, I'm going to point this out, Rebecca, none of them ever can even attempt to give you an example into nature, because they always have to go to the laboratory or selective breeding, which is, of course, men. And when men intervene, because we know men, we can't trust men. I mean, there's a reason why we don't. They always perversely do things. They lie, cheat, and steal. In the laboratory, they do it all the time. Like with the nylonase deception, when they introduced nylonase about 100 years ago, they said, oh, look, we think that this bacteria is now adapting to nylon. Well, then why didn't they prove that the bacteria didn't already have the enzyme, Rebecca? Oh, because it already did have the enzyme. It already had the ability to digest nylon, right? In fact, when you get nylon, people do realize that nylon still comes from Earth. It might be synthetic, but its original elements start here. We didn't get them from a magical other, alien world, right? So the reality is that's not adaptation. And what happens is that certain bacteria that already had the ability, and this is again in a laboratory, and I'm giving them every single chance they want because they won't talk about nature. So I'm trying to give the guy a conversation, which is what they'll use as examples, Rebecca. And the reality is that the bacteria that didn't have the ability die off, and the bacteria that already have the ability now take over. Well, that means that's not natural, but let's give it to them. That means that natural selection kept everything that already worked. Right? Everything that was already functioning, everything that already had the ability, everything that already was literally in its survivability mode stayed the same as well. Not only did it stayed the same. It didn't change into anything else, and it kept those already existing abilities. And this is giving them every benefit of the doubt. This is giving them every cheat sheet, every phone home to mom, every lifeline possible, and it still doesn't help any form of natural selection or adaptation, the scary word that a lot of creationists are having problems with. It's not adaptation if it already has the ability. Rather, it's epigenetics, which, epigenetics are when we have a genetic reaction. Have you ever had hives or goosebumps, or when we flinch? Men have facial hair. We can react to things different. Cats have whiskers. We can react without thinking, if that makes sense. That's actually a form of epigenetics because we have a genetic ability to react to things, right? We can cough. We can sneeze, we can itch. Like, that's not adaptation. That's the ability that we are already designed to have from the beginning. And I guarantee you, Rebecca, my parents also had the ability. So now you'd have to prove that my parents or any sort of biological creature, whether it's a plant, spore, mold, or fungus, right, or a mammal, or whatever classification, you'd have to prove now that the parents did not already have the ability. And we know what's going to happen once they try to do that. They're going to hit a brick wall and it's over. The conversation is going to end right there. If when you look into this natural selection thing, you'll find dozens of different definitions. And I have a 1911 dictionary, which is a great godsend. It's this really amazing book that the Lord sent me to give me, kind of this extra little credit here. And you'd be shocked that the definitions back then are very honest. And nowadays they're very foggy. They're almost ambiguous. I know people don't understand that word, but they are there's this fog and deception where they want to basically make everything really, hard to even fathom what you're talking about. And if you notice, all these gentlemen that they're speaking to you, and the guy was admitting it earlier, and I think you were laughing several times because he was talking about things that already exist. They already have this ability. They already had these genes. And it's like, yeah, bro, that's what we're telling you. All these things already exist, and you're claiming that's evolution. So my point here, and I'll just end with this, sorry for the diatribe, is that they're literally telling you, Rebecca, every day that staying the same is evolution. Did you notice that?
Yes, I did notice that. Yeah. It's the abilities that the organisms already have that,
Right.
you know, and the abilities to change, because I'm not arguing with changes being able to happen in organisms, but
Everything changes. There's no two organisms or a carbon copy, Rebecca. You're not, I know for a fact, you know, you might have been told that you look like your mother, but you're not identical to your mother. Period. Nothing is identical to its parents ever. Not even twins are not identical. There are some differences. And even if they are identical, that also is not going to help adaptation or evolution. So wait a minute, what are we arguing about here? If things are different, if things stay the same, neither version helps evolution or adaptation. We kind of like lose the argument in the fog. Wait a minute, what are we even arguing here? Like the guy was telling you earlier, I'm not going to say the D word, when kitty cats make more kittens, that's what they already were doing. And they're trying to tell you, well, the cats are different colors. Like I told you a week ago, the mommy and daddy were dark color and some of the babies were orange and white. Guess what? The orange and white already have their abilities. The gene pool already existed. One litter, there was no dark babies, right? Either way, they already have their abilities. So even when there is a drastic change, and you can use any example, and I love talking to creationists about this actually when it comes to this adaptation deception. But if something is different, let's say it's drastically different and there's a mutation, Rebecca, even if there is a drastic mutation, and I would like to use real world examples instead of imagination, like albinoism, right? Albinoism is an extreme example of a mutation, and the eyes turn red. In fact, men and women can get this exact same mutation. And what these are already designed fail-safe. In engineering, we call it a fail-safe. The genetics already have a backup system when something goes wrong, and it activates an already existing mechanism. And men do not understand how DNA works. That's what the more we delve into genetics, the more we delve into the genome, into the gene pools of creatures, the more we realize we don't understand that there's actually hidden powers and systems within the genetic gene pools of individual creatures. And we might all have similarities. That has nothing to do with evolution. Like lizards, dolphins, chickens, and people all have bones. Duh, that's because we have a designer that wants us to live in the same world. If we don't have many similarities, right, Rebecca, then we can't occupy the same space. How am I supposed to be able to interact with other things if they don't have a lot of similarities? They have to be able to breathe the same air, right, relatively. They have to be able to drink the same water. And we have to be able to be compatible as far as when it comes to intake foods and things like that. There has to be also limitations though. And what that guy was missing, I was hoping you were going to bring up, is the gene pool. The guy was really getting a little bit desperate talking about mice. Yes, mice have, the tortoise and the mice, and you and me, well, some of us have skulls, right? That's because we have that design. So you don't have to go to appendages. We don't have to go to the spine. Insects have skulls too, and they're actually exoskeleton. They're completely different. That has nothing to do with hereditary relation. It has to do with a designer that makes all things compatible to live in the same creation. And of course, that's what they are trying to avoid. And I liked when you pointed out that evolution demands unguided processes. That's actually hitting at their heart. That's true. They don't want to admit that. They'll say, oh, but there's theists that believe in evolution. Well, that means they have a problem if they believe in evolution, because that's actually going against all of the actual nature that we experience. And nature means design. That's another problem. They won't want to admit that nature, remember the nate means birth. You have a birth because it works. When we are birthed, that means the system works. It's as it is, fully functioning from the beginning. Imagine the first birthing scenario and everything wasn't in place at the same time. How's the next one going to go? Well, if the first one doesn't work, it's over. It has to everything by necessary antecedent to the consequence for infinity has to work from the very, very, very beginning, the Bereshit, the Genesis, Rebecca. So when these creationists say, well, the chances of life forming here on Earth or in outer space are 420 billion to 1, they're actually wrong. the chances are zero without a designer. You see, and that's what I don't understand why there's so many creationists trying to use these intellectual mathematical problems to say, oh yeah, the reason we know that God did this and this and that is because the math, and they'll give you this huge number. And then, Christians, like when I was a little child or a little, us being ignorant, laymen will go, oh, wow, that's amazing. It's 200 billion to 1. Well, that's a lie. It's not 200 billion to 1. The chances of life creating itself or functioning at all without a creator, the chances are 0.0 infinity zero. There is no chance whatsoever. And I'm not mad at those creationists. I'm not saying they need to quit their day job. I'm just saying that they haven't reached that level yet to just let themselves go. And that's okay. We all need to be forgiven. We all fall short, short of the glory, Rebecca. I'm a terrible sinner as well, and I need my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, to forgive me, and thank God he did. But he also gave me his wisdom because I gave myself up, and it's a wonderful miracle to experience his understanding. When we let ourselves go, he can enter our lives and show us this is how biology works. It's real simple. So what they're doing is that they're straining at a gnat and swallowing a camel. They're saying, look, the cat made different colored kittens. Therefore, what? Yes, that's our claim. Cats make different colored kittens. That's what they were already doing. And no matter how drastic of a difference, even if the cat's born with really short, there's some really interesting mutations I've seen in kitties lately. Maybe we're running out of time because now cats are being born sometimes with really, really short, stubby legs. That's a beautiful, cute mutation, but it's not going to help them in the wild, Rebecca. It's the opposite of evolution. They've now lost the ability and they have to live indoors. That cat will not survive as well as the normal functioning, the original gene pool, whether it's dogs, cats, whatever we pick. You pick any animal out of the entire column of God's green earth right now in existence, and every single creature came from its parents that were always the same species or kind. There's no exceptions. There's no such thing. So before I know that you have a limited time tonight. I don't want to take up everything.
I want to interrupt. Well,
go ahead.
One more thing, you guys, I want to bring this up while you're here because
go ahead.
Thompson's in the chat and he's saying like, all I did was relay the data in the paper, no lies detected. And I'm curious, what did you find when you looked up the dog thing? Did you look at this paper that he's talking about? Title of the paper?
Yes, there is. Yes, I can't find any claim for new DNA existing in any dog gene pool ever. If he has that claim, I'd love to read it because then I'm going to find people that are in big trouble. And for some reason, they haven't found the Nobel Peace Prize that they would receive. There's no such thing as new DNA in a dog. The DNA already exists because the dog has it now. That's literally claiming magic, and that's a fantasy. Now he can believe it, and maybe somebody lied to him. That's a problem, and we will expose that easily. But the internet hasn't caught up to that lie because Chat GPT can't find it. But if somebody wants to show that to me and extrapolate, great. I guarantee in a court of law, we're just going to laugh you out of the. There's no such thing. The DNAs in all creatures already exist. That's the point. There's a variation in all DNA that already exists. I guarantee the dog is not identical to its parents. Even pugs make pugs. They're not identical. And that has nothing to do with adaptation, let alone evolution anyway. So what we're doing now is we're arguing about something that doesn't help their claim anyway. And that's what the deception will do. Now, I'm not mad at him, and I'm not saying he's a liar, but what he's doing, he's making us argue something that doesn't help his point anyway. He needs to show adaptation in nature for one, and he needs to have evidence for new information in a gene pool, which he still has yet to show us evidence. A paper is not evidence. I can write a paper about magical sky fairies made out of spaghetti, and I can show that's the way they came from the planet Jupiter, and they gave me guitar lessons, and now I'm a guitar teacher. That's not evidence. So we actually need evidence, which is a whole nother level. So they have lots of papers, which is embarrassing because the evidence in reality is much more. When you get off the paperwork and you go out in reality, you won't be an evolutionist anymore. And that's why evolutionists hide behind words like, I have a paper. Well, that's why you're in trouble. You need to get some life experience. Let's get out there in the field and see what happens in reality. So I'll just end with this. The natural selection thing is just another tautology. There's no such thing. Yes, there's nature, and nature already works. Everything in nature depends on the fact that all the systems work. But here's the problem. The environment is not going to change the genetics. The genetics are changed by when the mommy or daddy, the girlfriend and boyfriend meet each other, either by chance or the hand of God. Neither of those scenarios have anything to do with selection that's going to help adaptation, let alone evolution. So even if natural selection is true, Rebecca, it has nothing to do with adaptation again, let alone evolution. Natural selection is going to guarantee it stays the same. So my question to them is, do they think staying exactly within the same gene pool, keeping the exact same abilities is adaptation? Good luck if you do, because then you've lost the plot. I have a medical dictionary. The reason I use a medical dictionary, Rebecca, is because we all use the same medical system. When an atheist or a Christian gets, their arm broken or gets sick and has a disease, we go to the doctor, we go to the medical systems, and their definitions are the ones that we have to go by. Well, they define evolution as the theory. It is a theory. Here's the key word here that we must let them know it is. They admit that evolution is the theory of evolution, that all plants and animals living come from a common ancestor. That's it. That all plants and animals that are different, plants and animals are not the same species, Rebecca, that, even a child knows that. Plants and animals are very different, and they all came from something that was the same. So something that was very simple, that was not a plant and not an animal, and not all these amazing, just ridiculously majestic, complicated living organisms in our wonderful creation, came from things that were not amazing, complicated creations, Rebecca. And there's absolutely no evidence in the history of the world. And that's why the medical system depends on the fact that adaptation cannot happen. And when they introduce antibiotics, things become, shall we say, immune, because the bacteria or the disease already has the ability, and the ones that don't have the ability die off, and things do not start mutating on the basis of adaptation. Things that already have the ability to survive continue to survive, and things that do not survive. It's really simple. That's how penicillin works. That's how the entire medical industry, when a doctor goes to operate on you, he's not going to operate on you based on the similarities of a monkey or a mouse. He's going to make sure that, yes, you are a wool man, and being part of mankind, he's going to operate on you based on the literal biology that already exists, and his wisdom and your biology is going to match within a parameter of that understanding, because evolution and adaptation cannot happen. They're just an absolute contradiction of everything we experience in reality, period, point blank. And again, we're not even talking about nature. We're allowing them to dictate this conversation, and we're hiding from the fact that we need this evidence in nature. But all we're talking about is selective breeding and the laboratory, which again can't help them. They've already admitted the nihility. We can just ask ChatGPT, and after about 10 minutes, you'll realize, wow, there's no evidence for any of this. There's no such thing as adaptation. Epigenetics means we already have the ability. All you got to do is go, did mommy and daddy already have this ability? If they say no, great, prove it. Prove that the parents did not have the ability. Well, they already admitted that they did. Are they going to change their mind now in 2026? Because we have 150 years of their admission that all of these things already have the ability. So the jig's up. Sorry, guys. There's no such thing. So thanks for allowing me to speak and go into my rant. And I appreciate you, and you keep up the good work. And maybe we can elaborate on this. But I want to show you that it is a problem in the creationist world. And that's what I wanted to get at, that you're understanding that, yes, creationists are also wrong. They have some growing to do. They need to allow themselves to learn. They're stuck in this. It's a secular bubble. They're using the secular terminology, and they wonder why they never have any fruit, because they're claiming the same thing. They're using terms like adaptation, natural selection, genetic drift. That's just a fancy way of saying cats making kittens, and it doesn't help anybody. So as soon as you get into that little deception, as soon as we get into and give into a little bit of a lie, Rebecca, then that's how a big lie starts. When I say that I believe in a little bit of a deception, is it okay to let your children around a little bit of evil? No, it's not. And that's what these people are doing. They're allowing their children to believe a little bit of Satan's lies, and then they wonder what, by the time they go to college when they're 25 years old, now they're an atheist and they think magical monkey soup turns into people. That's how it happens every time.
Okay. Thanks, Exo.
Baruch Hashem. Thanks for having me. I hope to talk to you soon. God bless it, and keep doing what you're doing. We're really happy with what you're doing, Rebecca. So you just keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Amen. God bless.
Yeah, God bless you. Okay, bye. So, I wanted to get back. Actually, I want to mention what Exo said about the definition of evolution from the medical dictionary or whatever, and how honest it is about what evolution is. And we do see a lot of attempts to try to take the spotlight off of what the actual theory says, because they want to soften it and make it something palatable, like something observable, like change in allele frequencies over time, right? Like that's the in a population over time. That's the definition that whenever I challenge evolution, you know, there's always somebody who wants to jump in and says, wait, evolution is only the change in the in allele frequencies in a population over time. No, that's not the definition of evolution that I'm challenging. That's the definition of evolution you're putting forward to try to make a ridiculous theory palatable, and it's not true. Now I want to get back to talking about Dr. Thompson. So there's some argument in the chat about what the study shows. Wes says the study claims that some genetic signatures are the result of hybridization, where DNA was introduced from one distinct breed to another. Okay, and then Dr. Thompson says the haplotype cannot be seen in dogs, in wolves, or in most breeds. Thus, it has to be new DNA that originated after the split between dogs and wolves. I think that's problematic, but I haven't actually read this paper, and I don't want to, but I probably will now, just because I want to get this straightened out, because I don't want to misrepresent anyone. And also, you know, why not find out the best information on this, right? So, okay, I've written down the name of that article, Dr. Thompson, and we'll look into it. Wes, thank you for looking at that and making comments about it. And now Dr. Thompson is telling me I should probably read it. Okay, I will do that, even though I have to say I'm really tired of the dog stuff. I already spent probably like, I don't know, 10 hours on the maned wolf and bush dog. And like, it's just such a not interesting topic to me. So I don't want to have to do the dog stuff, but I will read that one study. But I do want, Dr. Thompson, I want you to know that I do appreciate you. I was a little bit harsh with you, and I don't like to be harsh with people, but I really do hope that you will consider changing your approach a bit, because I think that, you know, we could have discussions with mutual respect, but I'm not feeling the respect coming from your end. And so, like, if you can't, like, you know, have respect for me, even though I have a different view of the world than you do, then, I mean, there really isn't the point in talking. But I do like talking to people who have scientific expertise. I just don't want to be, you know, anyway, I'll send you an email about this, because I probably shouldn't even be doing this on a live conversation. I mean, on a live chat. But I just wanted to say that, like, I do appreciate you coming on, and I appreciate you preparing things to come on. And so thank you for doing that. And I hope we can have better conversations in the future. And thank you, everyone, for very fruitful conversations tonight. Appreciate you guys. And Laser Fan says, next time I'd like to talk about genomic similarities of humans and chimpanzees. Great. I would love to talk about that. And so thank you, Steve Estabon, for coming on. Appreciate you. And I appreciate all the support. Thank you guys for watching tonight. And yeah, if anybody also wants to just come on one-on-one for a full time, email me, because I'll set up a stream where nobody else can join. There's not going to be anybody waiting backstage, and we can have a conversation. So Wes has one last thing that he shares. He says, Ephrin type B receptor 1 is a known gene which was not novel, but a new border collie specific T allele variant was indeed observed. Thank you, Wes. Appreciate that. And so anyway, take care. Thank you, and God bless you.